Chapter 138. Seeing that the other party's commander did not put the Egyptian army in his eyes at all, Aman did not want to lose morale and coughed lightly. Maidan understood what he meant. He waved his hand and signaled for the guards to separate. Then he drove Aman's chariot out of the battle formation. When the chariot stopped, Aman stood up and bowed slightly. He looked at Gilgamesh and said, "Governor of Uruk, a hero revered by the people of the continent, I have always admired your achievements. But today, you have led your army to invade the land that does not belong to you and harm the people of a foreign country. Why? This is not a place where your army should be. I welcome you as a guest, but I will not tolerate such aggression. Please withdraw your army immediately." Gilgamesh also stood up and bowed slightly. "Is it Aman? We have met before. You killed the serpent on the Euphrates River and saved the people of Uruk. I thank you for your heroic act. I heard that you have captured King Hittite alive and facilitated the peace talks between the two countries. I admire you even more. But today's war is not between you and me. I have come under the guidance of the oracle to punish the cruel king of Igut." He paused and smiled. Then he said in a mocking tone, "If you are talking about a retreat, your army has already withdrawn from the border to here as I requested. I am very grateful for your warm welcome." The soldiers behind Gilgamesh roared with laughter. They were laughing at the Igut army for abandoning the border and fleeing. This was an open field where tens of thousands of soldiers were facing off against each other. Their voices weren't loud, but every soldier present could hear them clearly. The laughter of thousands of people gathered together like rolling thunder, but Gilgamesh's voice suppressed the rolling thunder, still sounding so clear. He unfurled the parchment in his hand and began to read it aloud. Aman had already seen the contents of the parchment. It was a declaration of war issued by the Uruk Legion. The style of the declaration was like a hymn to the gods. Every time Gilgamesh read a sentence, the soldiers cheered. In the end, the cheers turned into passionate shouts. By the time the declaration was finished, all the soldiers behind him had reached the peak of morale. Gilgamesh was a 9th-level supreme mage, and there were differences between different people who had achieved the same level of 9th level. For example, Aman was a 7th-level sorcerer, but his magic was profound and his means were far superior to the average 7th-level mage. Gilgamesh, on the other hand, had obviously reached the peak of the 9th level. While reciting the declaration, he quietly used what was almost the most brilliant mind control magic in the world to boost the morale of the army. And when his voice reached the Egyptian army, it carried a kind of shocking power, making people feel invincible and irresistible. Imperceptibly, there was a feeling of doubt and wavering in their beliefs. The army had not officially charged, but the battle had already begun. Aman began to speak. His voice was deep and carried a strange vibration. It was as if he had suddenly spoken right next to everyone's ears, giving them a feeling of being startled and suddenly coming back to their senses. In terms of magic alone, Aman was naturally not as good as Gilgamesh, but he was not bad either. The commander-in-chief of the Igut army sneered. "You read too many names just now. I'm sorry, I didn't remember them. Is there no one else in the kingdom of Babylon? Do you need dozens of people to write a poem? Dear Governor, there are no flowers or wine here. This is not the place for you to recite poems. If you want to fight, fight. Behind me are heroes like you." At the end of the declaration, he praised Marduk's title. Aman's words were obviously disrespectful to this god. Gilgamesh closed the parchment and glanced at him from afar. He seemed to want to laugh, but then his face darkened and he raised his right hand and waved it forward. The army behind him moved. At first, the speed was not very fast. The orderly chariots and the heavy cavalry on both flanks rumbled towards the Igut army. The earth trembled slightly, with a heavy sense of oppression, as if knocking on everyone's heart. The sense of oppression in the army's advance was also a psychological impact. If the Igut army stood still, as the speed of the enemy's chariots increased, they would inevitably be at a disadvantage. Facing the most powerful army on the continent, some of the Igut soldiers' calves were already trembling slightly. Standing on the chariot, Aman raised his left hand to the sky, and the sound of war drums came from the army behind him. The Supreme Mage George personally beat the drums, and the sound of the drums seemed to have a strange power that could awaken the confidence and courage of the soldiers. Aman pointed his hand forward again, and the battle formation of Igut also moved, slowly meeting the enemy's battle formation with the sound of the drums. As they approached, the sound of the drums became more and more intense, and the speed at which the battle formation advanced also became faster and faster. The impact of the chariots gradually broke out, and would reach the climax when they collided with the enemy formation. The accompanying mages formed a large magic formation in the camp. Julian flew high in the sky with his staff in hand, and the sound of chanting constantly came from the sky, as if to encourage the charging soldiers to forget all fear. The two sides pushed forward, and at the same time, the chariots of Gilgamesh and Aman were drowned. The bright swords and spears were dazzling, and it was impossible to see each other clearly. At this moment, everyone on the battlefield heard Gilgamesh's soft shout again, "Shameless and cowardly man of Igut, how dare you slander me for assassinating the so-called adoratress of the temple of Isis, please watch carefully my arrow." By the time everyone heard this, Gilgamesh's arrow had already been released. A shrill roar came from the wilderness, like the roar of thousands of wild bulls. Even the speeding chariots of both sides stopped for a moment. Gilgamesh shot an earth-shattering arrow in the midst of thousands of soldiers. The bow he used was made from the tusks of Humbaba and the tendons of a snake. Aman had been watching Gilgamesh's movements, and he had long been ready. When the other side drew his bow, he also drew his bow and nocked an arrow. Gilgamesh hated rumors on the continent the most, and today he would use this method to get his revenge. Looking at the arrow, Aman subconsciously compared it to the arrow shot by the assassin in the square that day. He remembered that the assassin shot a black crossbow arrow, 5 feet long and as thick as a wine cup. It was like a spear. The crossbow arrow was blocked in the air, making a roar like waves crashing against the reef. It only paused for a few seconds, and then continued to fly towards the target at the same speed and direction. The crossbow arrow itself must have been a very precious magic artifact, with energy magic attached to it. It was incredibly powerful. Gilgamesh's arrow, though precious, was much more common. It was made of damask steel, plated with heavy silver, and engraved with magic patterns. The arrow was 2 feet long and as thick as a finger. It looked like a silver bolt of lightning under the sunlight. A terrifying roar echoed in the wilderness. It was Humbaba's angry roar. Aman also shot 3 arrows in a row. The arrows he used were almost the same as his opponent's, and the bow was made from the tusks and tendons of the two-headed serpent. Every arrow that was shot out carried a sharp whistle that cut through the air, hitting Gilgamesh's arrows. The 2 arrows collided in the air with a loud explosion, and Aman's arrow was immediately shattered into several pieces. The roar in the wilderness seemed to weaken a little, and Gilgamesh's arrow only paused for a moment, then continued to fly at the same speed and direction. The 3 arrows collided in the air, and the result was the same. Aman shot 3 arrows in a row, but failed to block Gilgamesh's arrow. Gilgamesh's arrow was already in front of the formation, and the roar of the arrow caused a strong blast that overturned the 2 chariots in front of Aman. Aman did not move, nor did he dodge. He just stood there and raised his iron staff. At this time, Madanzo, who was driving the chariot, let out a roar, pulled out his heavy sword, and leaped high with a dazzling silver light. A silver light silently exploded in the air, and Madanzo was shaken down. The arrow pierced through the silver light and continued to fall towards Aman. At this time, there was another clear shout, and a heavy shield flew out from the right side of the formation, smashing towards the arrow with a gust of wind. Gabriel also made a move. She was a little far away and couldn't block in front of Aman in time, so she threw out a giant shield with all her strength. There was a deafening sound of metal colliding, and the door-sized shield was instantly torn apart. The arrow paused for a moment, then continued to fly towards Aman. At this time, countless rays of light fell from the sky, forming a colorful shield to protect Aman's figure. Julian was floating in the air above Aman, presiding over the magic formation in the formation. At this time, seeing that the commander was attacked, of course, she had to use magic to protect him. The earth-shattering arrow finally slowed down, continuously breaking through the various shields, sending out waves of rippling shock waves. The roar in the wilderness also gradually subsided. Aman raised his iron staff and pointed at the flying arrow. It strangely paused at the tip of the staff, and so it was fixed in the air by Aman's final spatial magic. Aman put away his staff, and the arrow fell, and he reached out and caught it firmly. The silver arrow was scorching hot, as if it had been burned in a raging fire. Regardless of how the arrow was shot, the soldiers around him cheered when they saw the commander-in-chief catch it firmly. But Aman himself was shocked. Gilgamesh had used a standard magic arrow on the battlefield, but the power of this arrow was clearly greater than the arrow shot by the assassin that day. Although the scene looked threatening but not dangerous, and he also caught the arrow with ease, the situation was different. That day, the assassin had shot an arrow out of the blue, and no one present had expected it, so there was no need to take any precautions. But today, Gilgamesh had shot it out from the battle formation, and all the experts were already prepared for it. The cheers of the soldiers around him immediately turned into horrified cries, for a burly figure high in the sky swung his golden fist and was hitting the supreme mage Julian. Too many things happened on the battlefield so fast that people could hardly react. After Gilgamesh shot the arrow, he closed his eyes and sat down to take a deep breath, as if it was very exhausting. At this moment, Enkidu suddenly jumped out of the chariot, and the ground made a loud bang, smoke and dust rose, and then he jumped high into the air. Why did this supreme warrior jump so high? No matter how high he jumped, he couldn't fly. Looking at the arc of his jump in the air, he should have landed just in front of the charging army. Did he want to lead the chariot army in a charge on foot with his bare hands? The army charged, and the soldiers were highly nervous, concentrating only on the oncoming enemy formation, waiting for the flying arrows and spears. No one looked around or looked up at the sky. So when Enkidu leaped high into the air, almost none of the Egyptian soldiers on the opposite side noticed him. Moreover, his speed was too fast, and his figure was like a blurry shadow. On the chariot, however, Aman could see it clearly. He had just caught an arrow that fell from the sky and was looking up in that direction. As soon as he saw the speed and height of Enkidu's leap, he immediately drew his bow and shot an arrow. It was Gilgamesh's arrow. This arrow was not aimed at the sky, but at the front of the Uruk legion, where Enkidu was about to land. This arrow did not hit Enkidu, but it could not be considered a miss either. The silver arrow pierced straight into the ground, and with a loud boom, a surging force overturned the two oncoming chariots. The frontmost soldiers of Igut's army cheered. Gilgamesh's arrow had overturned the two chariots at the very front of Igut's army. Now that their commander-in-chief had returned the same arrow, it looked like they were evenly matched. Aman had already shot 4 arrows, and when the last arrow left the bowstring, he felt his whole body go numb, and for a moment he felt very weak. This kind of archery was not as easy as eating beans. It was a fusion of willpower and strength, and his spirit was tighter than the bowstring. He needed to catch his breath to recover. But at this moment, Aman's mouth opened wide in shock. Aman's last arrow did not hit Enkidu. Where did this supreme warrior go? Just as Aman drew his bow and knocked his 4th arrow, Gilgamesh, who was sitting in the distant battle formation, suddenly opened his eyes, stood up, and made a shooting motion with his bow. There was no real arrow on his bowstring, but an invisible arrow condensed from energy magic. The target was actually Enkidu in the air. When Enkidu leaped to the highest point of the parabola in the air, Gilgamesh's invisible arrow hit him in the back. Enkidu's snake scales exploded with a distorted light, and a huge energy shockwave spread out silently. The light and shadow distorted and seemed to blend into the background of the sky, and the burly figure of the supreme warrior became blurred. He suddenly accelerated and flew diagonally upwards, instantly appearing in front of Arya's eyes, waving a golden fist in the distorted light and shadow. The arrow that Gilgamesh shot from the bowstring not only contained powerful energy magic, information magic that distorted light and shadow to hide the figure, but also spatial magic that transformed energy into speed. The flesh and blood of mortals could not withstand this arrow at all. Ordinary people would probably mistakenly think that Gilgamesh was going to kill Enkidu, but this 9th-level supreme warrior wearing snake scales took the arrow head-on, and then suddenly appeared in front of Julian high in the sky. No one thought that the two of them would play like this. The tacit understanding between them was simply indescribable. After Gilgamesh shot this silent second arrow, he put down his bow and sat on a chair, closed his eyes, and meditated, entering a deep state of meditation. These 2 arrows were not easy, and he also needed to take a breath to recover. He seemed to be indifferent to the battle ahead and Enkidu in the air, as if he was full of confidence. It took a long time to describe, but this series of changes happened extremely quickly. Julian operated the magic formation to protect Amon's figure, and felt that something was wrong. As soon as he raised his head, Enkidu had already arrived. It was not that he was not vigilant. Who would have thought that a supreme warrior could fly from the enemy's formation so fast in front of him? An 8th-level supreme mage could instantly cast supreme magic. As soon as he thought of it, a harsh scream came from high in the sky. This was an extremely brilliant sound barrier magic, which was both a strong defense and a sharp attack. The high-frequency tremor could smash boulders into powder, but it could not stop Enkidu's flesh and blood. Enkidu did not even slow down. His huge fist came straight at Amon, and a deafening sound rang out in the sky. It sounded like countless pieces of glass being shattered. The sound wave barrier came to an abrupt halt as soon as it was cast. Enkidu did not take any weapons. His giant shield and broadsword were still in the carriage. At this moment, he only wore a pair of very thin golden gloves. Gloves were not gloves. When the fist was clenched, the palm of the hand was empty, only protecting the back of the hand and the external joints of the fingers. This pair of gloves was made of the hardest snakeskin on the back of Humbaba's 9-forked snakeskin. Enkidu punched at an incredible speed in the distorted light and shadow. His fist was like a meteor, and the gloves glowed with a golden light with a tail flame. Julian held the staff in his right hand and took out 2 scrolls in his left, but it was too late to unroll them. At such a close distance, almost face to face, unrolling the scrolls was also an attack. It was better to just commit suicide. Moreover, it took some time to unroll the scrolls. For a supreme mage like him, it was better to use his own instantaneous magic in a timely manner. Julian shook his staff and activated the air elemental armor. The air around him seemed to solidify into a thick layer of transparent armor. The outer layer was sticky, and the deeper it went, the harder it became. The innermost layer was as hard as steel. This was the most advanced elemental defense magic, and it was most suitable for use in the empty sky. Then there was a cracking sound, and the staff in Julian's hand broke into several pieces. There was another muffled bang, and the air turbulence surged. The body of the supreme mage dispersed into a cloud of bloody smoke with the explosion of the air elemental armor. Julian's air elemental armor had not been fully unfolded before it was smashed by Enkidu's punch. His casting was abruptly interrupted by a powerful force, and the staff in his hand was also destroyed. The power of this punch was almost indescribable. The air elemental armor burst. How could Julian's body withstand such an impact? He immediately turned into a cloud of blood in the air. Chapter 139. An arduous battle. High up in the sky, all kinds of magic and energy were mixed together. For a moment, it was difficult to detect the situation there. Then, a large number of things fell from the red mist, including Julian's broken staff, 2 unopened scrolls, and a space ring. With a wave of his hand, Ai put away the scrolls and the space ring. He raised his iron branch as if he was facing a formidable enemy. Enkidu was a pure warrior. After all, he couldn't fly. His burly figure finally fell from the sky, like a meteorite falling straight into the battle formation behind Ai. Although Julian was dead, the magic she used before her death had blocked Enkidu. Otherwise, the Supreme Warrior would have been in big trouble if he had flown to the back and landed among the mages at the back of the battle formation. Enkidu fell from the sky head first. Before he landed, arrows rained down from the sky. The warrior shouted. The snake scale armor on his body glowed brightly. There was a faint roar in the air, and the arrows bounced off before they could get close to him. When he was still 10 feet from the ground, Enkidu suddenly punched the air. The gauntlet emitted a golden light with a tail flame. The huge force hit the ground, smashing a shallow pit. Several chariots were smashed. Smoke and dust rose in all directions. More than a dozen soldiers directly below him were instantly killed, not even their corpses were left. This was his second punch. The Supreme Warrior used the recoil force to turn around in the air and land steadily. His burly figure was so flexible. The surrounding soldiers were shaken by the impact of this punch. They couldn't stand steadily and were thrown off their horses. At this time, Ai shouted, "Disperse!" Letting ordinary soldiers surround the continent's #1 warrior in close combat was simply throwing their lives away. Ordinary swords, spears, and arrows couldn't even get close to Enkidu's body. Moreover, they were in a charging formation. If they fought from the rear, the entire formation would be destroyed. No wonder Gilgamesh trusted Enkidu so much that he let him fall into the enemy's formation. This warrior was indeed fearless and could really take the head of a general in an army of 10,000. Gilgamesh shot out 2 arrows, one real and one fake. The fake arrow was real, and the real one was fake. The first arrow seemed to be powerful, but it was just a bluff. The second arrow was silent, but it suddenly sent Enkidu into the air above the enemy lines. The 8th level Supreme Mage Julian was caught off guard and killed on the spot. This was also a silent declaration. If they were really the assassins at the blessing ceremony, would they have failed to assassinate him in such a way? The surrounding chariots dispersed according to Os order, and the place where Enkidu landed became an empty space. Before the dust settled, a dazzling silver light with a tail feather came flying straight at Enkidu. It was Ai who got out of his chariot and swung his iron staff down from the air. He didn't use any fancy magic. Using any magic consumed magic power and required a moment of time. It might be useful against others, but against a supreme warrior who could break 100 tricks with brute force, Ai concentrated all his pure power and channeled all his magic power into his staff, launching the strongest blow of his life. Enkidu's reaction was beyond imagination. He turned around and threw a third punch. Ai held his staff with both hands in the air and hit Enkidu with the tip of the staff. But Enkidu suddenly jumped over at an incredible speed and the punch hit the staff between Ai's hands. Thanks to Crazy Ol, this magical staff made of damask steel was extraordinarily tough. When the golden glove hit it, the staff buzzed, but it was not broken. Ai's 10 fingers were numb, but he held the staff tightly and did not let it fall. The power of a supreme warrior was very similar to energy magic. The huge impact spread throughout his body, and Ai's body seemed to be squeezed into pieces. The scorpion shell armor on his body made a grinding sound, and a flowing black light burst out. The staff trembled violently. Ai came from the air and flew into the air. He was punched by Enkidu and flew far into the middle of the battlefield, and the chariot formations on both sides had not yet collided. Enkidu threw a total of 3 punches. The first punch killed the Supreme Mage Julian, which was equivalent to breaking the magic formation of Igut's army. The second punch smashed an empty space in the enemy camp, almost disrupting the formation of the charging army. The third punch sent the enemy's commander flying out of the formation and landing in the middle of the battlefield where the battle was about to begin. At this moment, the Supreme Mage George flew high into the sky at great speed with a war drum and a staff in his hand. The sound of the drum did not stop, but he immediately took over Julian's position and presided over the magic formation again. Julian died under Enkidu's fist, and an 8th-level Supreme Mage did not even have time to fight back. It took great courage to take over his position at this moment, but George did not hesitate. The army could not, and he did not believe that Enkidu could fly up. He wanted to use the power of the magic formation to deal with Enkidu in the open space. Even if he could trap the continent's #1 warrior, he could at least smash him to death with a scroll, right? Enkidu was extremely bold and arrogant, but he was not reckless or stupid. As soon as George flew high into the air and stood still, he punched Ai and then ran wildly, rushing out of Igut's formation. His speed was much faster than the chariots in front of him. He swept his fists along the way, knocking away the chariots that were charging in front of him, and actually broke a gap in the middle of the vanguard of Igut's army, and went straight to Ai, who had just landed. If it had been a normal battle, before the two armies had officially started fighting, Igut's side would have probably been defeated, because the commander of the army had been thrown out of the formation like a bag. How could the soldiers in the rear not? At this time, a team rushed forward, filling the gap in the middle of the formation, and chased after Enkidu like crazy. This team of cavalry with dazzling armor was Ai's personal guards trained in the Inare Legion, and the one in front was Madanzo. Madanzo had already leaped onto his warhorse, leading his personal guards to chase after Enkidu, who was rushing towards Ai. The armor and weapons of this personal guard were personally purchased by Ai, and they were very light and portable, but their impact and defensive effects were stronger than heavy cavalry. The personal guard was not afraid of Enkidu's power, and instead risked their lives to save the commander. Although they could not catch up, their morale was quite high. George took this opportunity to shout in the air, "All armies, engage! Commander-in-Chief Ai will kill Enkidu with his own hands." The soldiers at the front line raised their weapons and shouted excitedly, and the speed of their charge finally reached its maximum. Just now, Enkidu threw 3 punches in a circle from the sky to the ground, but only the masters of the army and the nearby soldiers saw it clearly, and the rest of the soldiers on the entire battlefront did not notice. Everyone's attention was attracted by the first arrow shot by Gilgamesh, and Ai's return arrow did not lose the slightest bit of face. Hearing George's shout in the air, many people thought that Commander-in-Chief Ai was going to fight with Enkidu one-on-one to prove who was the real #1 warrior on the continent. Didn't King Hittite give this title to Ai? The soldiers did not have time to think about why the voice in the air was not Julian, but George. Ai flew out of the formation, and the ground in the middle of the battlefield suddenly seemed to be flattened by a giant hand. He operated spatial magic and air magic, and controlled his body to stand firmly on the ground. The chariots of the Egyptian army were rumbling like thunder as they charged forward. At the front of the Egyptian army, a burly man ran even faster than the chariots. He leaped high into the air and flew to the center of the battlefield, throwing a punch at Amon. This Enkidu was targeting Ai, and not satisfied after sending him flying, he rushed over and punched again. The power of this punch was not as strong as the first 3, but it was still majestic, and no one dared to take it head-on. Ai held his staff with both hands and swung it at Enkidu. This time, the staff did not directly hit, but there was a gust of wind around it. Ai's body swayed, and the light and shadow distorted, as if he had changed positions, but in fact, he was still standing in the same place. He used spatial magic to resist and dissolve the power of this punch, and at the same time, he felt a soreness in his joints. Enkidu landed on the ground, and the ground trembled slightly. He swung his fist at Ai again. This kind of head-on fighting was almost impossible to resolve, and the explosive energy could dissipate the teleportation effect of spatial magic. Ai shouted and swung his staff forward. His fist and the staff were a few feet apart, and a white light burst out in the air, and with a bang, Ai was knocked back a few steps before he could stand firm. Enkidu did not follow up with another attack, but suddenly turned around and punched behind him, and the power of the punch hit the tip of a sword that was stabbing straight at him. It turned out that Madanzo had arrived. This guard captain was the fastest, and he had left the caravan and cavalry far behind. The battlefield was very noisy, and he used magic to conceal the sound of his horse's hooves as much as possible. Under the rumbling sound of the chariots, he arrived almost without a sound, and with the momentum of the galloping horse, he stabbed at Enkidu's heart from the back. Madanzo used a magic heavy sword that disguised his staff as a sword hilt. The blade of the sword had a faint silver light, and there was a spiral of air swirling in front of the tip of the sword. He used his magic to cast spatial magic, and with the sharpness of the sword, it was the most difficult sneak attack to defend against. But Enkidu did not let him succeed. He turned around and punched again with a golden light, and Madanzo's precious heavy sword was broken into pieces, leaving only a bare staff in his hand. The impact of the force swept Madanzo into the air, and the silver armor on his body also shattered, revealing the black scorpion shell armor he wore underneath. Madanzo flipped and landed not far away, but the horse he was riding was sent flying far away, and it was smashed into pieces by the wind of the fist. It did not even have the time to whine. After knocking Madanzo back with his right fist, Enkidu turned around again and punched with his left fist. At this time, a silver light slashed at him from the side. It was Gabriel leaping into the air with a battle-axe in his hand, and fiercely chopped down. The wind of the fist and the battle-axe collided, and the silver light was scattered, and the battle-axe also had a bowl-sized hole. Gabriel somersaulted in the air, and his helmet fell to the ground. His long golden hair scattered, and fell to the other side. Took out a battle-axe and a shield out of thin air and threw them to Gabriel, and shouted in a hoarse voice, "Tire him to death." After breaking through, the infantry phalanxes also entered the battle. The charging soldiers took turns advancing and retreating. The Uruk Legion was truly powerful. George pushed almost all of his reserve troops to the front line, and only then did he barely manage to stabilize his position. Taking advantage of the time when the enemy retracted their chariots, he launched a few more counterattacks. Chariots required speed to display their superiority. Therefore, they couldn't all charge into the battlefield at once. They needed to take turns to charge under the cover of the infantry. The battle was like waves crashing into one another, abnormally bitter and desperate. The chanting of the mages floated in the air, and a soft light sprinkled down. The most important function was to calm the soldiers' hearts and make them forget their fear. The second was to relieve the pain of the injured soldiers. In most battles, half of the injured soldiers died of shock caused by pain, not because their injuries were incurable. The mages would also get tired. Every position in the magic formation needed to be rotated, except for the Supreme Mage George, who was always on the front line. Igut's army did not have the upper hand, and the battle was very difficult. The front line was slowly retreating, but it did not collapse. This was more or less out of Gilgamesh's expectations. The expedition this time had been like a hot knife cutting through butter, and only today did they encounter their first tough battle. The mages of the Uruk Legion were not idle either. They were doing the same thing as their opponents. Gilgamesh was still sitting there after the battle had begun. However, in the sky behind the Uruk Legion, a figure appeared. He was cloaked in a colorful light, like a god. It was the figure of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh was still sitting in the chariot, but another Gilgamesh appeared in the sky. He became the center of the magic formation and gave orders to the entire army. Gilgamesh was not a god, but he was able to perform such a miracle. George, who was far away in the sky, sighed. He did not have the ability to do so. He could no longer describe what kind of magic it was. Message magic, spatial magic, energy magic, elemental magic. It could condense one's will to form an image of oneself, but it was not an illusion. While sighing, George also played a little trick. With a wave of his staff, he cloaked himself in a colorful light. It was just a simple message magic, but it did not seem to be lacking in prestige. After a dozen rounds of charging from morning to afternoon, the soldiers on both sides were tired. The casualties of the Igut Legion were obviously higher, but as long as their camp did not collapse, the difference in casualties would not be too big. After all, to kill 1,000 of the enemy, they would have to sacrifice 800 of their own. In the center of the battle, there was a vacuum. Sand and pebbles flew everywhere, making all kinds of loud noises. The 4 supreme warriors were still fighting. The soldiers on the front lines had been charging for a few rounds, but together with Madanzo and Gabriel, had been fighting with Enkidu until now. They did not even have a moment to rest. The soldiers were tired, and was naturally tired as well. Wei was a 7th level supreme warrior, but at the same time, he was also a 7th level supreme magician. His diligence, endurance, magic power, and tenacity of will were almost unmatched by anyone else he had ever met. It was not only because of his talent, but also because of the hardships he had gone through. Ordinary supreme warriors, no matter how hard they trained, would not have experienced what had. But today, had met his match. Enkidu was simply a tireless god of war. He did use all his strength in the first 3 punches, and after that, did not give him a chance to breathe. He used all kinds of methods in the battle. There were all kinds of energy around their battle, and people outside could not see clearly. Even detection magic was disrupted. The magic used by and Madanzo were very simple. It was a combination of spatial magic and energy magic to enhance the power of a supreme warrior, but it also implied the magic power of a mage. This was the most effective way to deal with Enkidu. Gabriel, who was fighting, did not notice anything unusual, and she could also use magic to assist in the battle. Chapter 140. Countermeasures. The 3 supreme warriors could not defeat Enkidu, and Enkidu's main focus was on punches. Under the cover of the 2 supreme warriors, had relied on his powerful strength to hold on until now. Enkidu did not actually land a punch on him, but his scorpion shell armor was already damaged in many places, and he began to feel nauseous. This was a sign that his strength was being used to the extreme. Suddenly came to his senses. He wanted to trap Enkidu, but in fact, he was trapped by Enkidu in the middle of the battlefield. As the commander, he was separated from the army and could not command the battle. If the battle continued like this, would be the first to die of exhaustion. If it was a battle of strength, stamina, and endurance, Enkidu would definitely be the last one among the 4. George was commanding the army, but there were some things that he could not make decisions on his own, such as giving the order to retreat. Furthermore, George could not mobilize the troops guarding Kenmut and the defensive line in the mountain range. For the first battle, it was impossible for to place all his troops outside the defensive line, and the Uruk Legion could not send all their troops to the front lines. And the other 2 supreme warriors were doing their best to hold back Enkidu, but the strength of the strongest warrior on the continent was clearly beyond their imagination. If there was even the slightest flaw in their coordination, they would be defeated. If they continued to fight, they might not be able to hold on for much longer. As the commander, he could not die in front of the 2 armies, or the Igut army would definitely collapse. Just as he was thinking about this, Enkidu let out a loud roar and threw out a punch. Although the punch seemed dull, it directly hit the tip of Ajin's staff. After a long battle, this supreme warrior was still able to suddenly exert his strength and send Ajin flying more than 10 feet away. Then, he turned around and brought up a whirlwind. Both his fists glowed with golden light, and at the same time, he sent Gabriel and Madanzo flying far away. The shield in Gabriel's hand finally shattered. The coordination between the 3 was broken in an instant. Gabriel and Madanzo were already on the verge of exhaustion, but Enkidu was still able to exert strength. Could it be that he wanted to end the battle now? But at this moment, something unexpected happened. Ah's left hand released his staff for the first time. His nails were stained with blood, and he took out something from his bosom and waved it forward. There was a crashing sound in the air, and countless boulders the size of tables suddenly fell, piling up into a mountain in an instant, burying Enkidu under it. Had heard from Goliath that Enkidu was a pure 9th-level warrior. He had always trained only in body arts and did not spend any effort on magic arts, reaching a peak that others could not reach. Knew that he was going to encounter Enkidu on the battlefield, and he had been thinking of countermeasures. The suicidal Tiamat's wrath could not be used, and it was difficult to use the scroll in a face-to-face battle. Was there any other way to win by surprise? He was a supreme sorcerer, so he naturally had to make use of all his advantages. As military tactics were very formal, and his command and training of legions were also very strict and meticulous. But the body arts and magic arts he learned were unorthodox, completely different from the habits of ordinary warriors and mages. Many of his methods were unexpected and even beyond imagination. Otherwise, he would not have been able to sneak hundreds of miles away and kidnap the king of Hittite. Recalled all his experience of fighting others, and he felt that there was only one trick that could work. He had used this trick in the bitter battle against his pursuers by the Euphrates River, which was to suddenly wave out a spatial artifact and throw out all the random things stored in it. Almost no supreme mage had ever done this in a battle. He was also taking advantage of Enkidu's lack of magic arts, so he thought of this trick. Today, what he had stored in the bone was not random things, but a single boulder, almost reaching the limit of his magical power to use the bone. At this time, he had no choice but to throw it out. If he continued to fight, he would be exhausted and unable to use his magical power, and his trump card would be ineffective. A large ship full of boulders poured down from the sky. Enkidu, who was in the middle of the battle, did not have time to react. Caught off guard, he was buried under the mountain of boulders, not knowing whether he was dead or alive. Ku didn't expect that this move would be able to kill the continent's #1 warrior. She waved her staff, and the surrounding soil and rocks flew up and landed on the stone mountain. In an instant, it condensed into a layer of sturdy shell, sealing all the gaps. This was an advanced earth elemental defense spell, wall fortification. Was not using it for defense, but to strengthen the stone mountain and seal Enkidu inside. If it was an ordinary supreme warrior, he would have been crushed to death by now. Even if he could not be crushed to death, he would be crushed to death under the weight of the stone mountain. Even if he could not be crushed to death, he would suffocate to death. However, was not sure that he could subdue Enkidu, so he immediately called out, "Retreat." He rushed out of the battlefield with the two supreme warriors, overturning the enemy's obstruction along the way, and returned to his own army. As personal guards could not get close to the place where the supreme warriors were fighting. At this moment, seeing that their commander had escaped, they also retreated from the battlefield and escorted back to his army. Idu could see everything clearly from the sky, and he immediately shouted, "My soldiers, the head of the legion has killed Enkidu and returned victorious." His voice was immediately drowned out by a roar. A golden light burst out from the mountain, and from the boulders flying, a burly figure jumped out and landed on top of the pile of boulders. He pointed at Igut's army and cursed, "You despicable coward." The reply was a burst of laughter. Sat in his chariot, surrounded by his personal guards, and replied with a laughter that spread throughout the battlefield, "Oh, it's Enkidu, why are you not dead yet?" My apologies, I thought that your excellency had died in battle. I stopped too early." After saying this, he coughed twice and covered his mouth. He felt dizzy, and his body felt weak. He could barely muster any strength. In the distance, the sound of a horn could be heard. Gilgamesh had given the order to retreat. Also raised his left hand, with his palm facing backwards. The sound of a horn could also be heard from Igut's army. It was a low and drawn-out sound, an order for the entire army to retreat. Today was only the first battle. Since they could not defeat the enemy, no matter who won or lost, it was not the final result. Both armies needed to rest and reorganize before fighting again. The commanders of both sides gave the order to retreat at the same time. Retreating did not mean moving backwards. The soldiers armed with spears and long shields surged forward like a tide. The sturdy shields were next to each other, and groups of 10 formed a shield wall. The spears in the middle of the shield wall pointed forward like a hedgehog. Under the command of their captains, the soldiers who were engaged in battle retreated back to their own formations through the gaps between the shield walls. Then, the shield walls closed up, and the entire formation retreated in an orderly manner, not giving the enemy a chance to launch a sneak attack. Had been sitting on a chair with his eyes closed. His breathing was deep and even, but he did not say a word or stand up. After returning to the rear from the battle, once he relaxed, the feeling of exhaustion and weakness was indescribable. He really wanted to lie down and sleep for a few days and nights. Unfortunately, he was the commander and was destined to not relax. He sat on a chair and was carried into Kenmet by 4 guards. Gabriel and Madanzo were also helped into the city. After opened his eyes, he gave an order for Ricard, the chief priest of the Horus Legion, and Vord, the chief priest of the Legion of Isis, to take turns to cast healing and blessing magic to help him and the 2 supreme warriors recover their strength and relieve their fatigue. Ricard was the high priest of the Horus Legion, and Vord was the high priest of the Temple of Isis. Both of them were elders of the Igut Academy of Magic. There were only 6 9th-level supreme mages in the Empire of Igut, so one could imagine how high their status was. But now that they were on the battlefield, was the commander-in-chief. Once he had power in his hands, he had to follow his orders. He actually asked the 2 supreme mages to take turns to heal and bless him like ordinary priests. The exhausted did not care too much at this moment. He just wanted to recover as soon as possible. In his opinion, wasn't magic supposed to be used like this? The higher one's achievement, the more useful it would be. If he didn't use it now, when would he? The 2 supreme mages did not go to the front line today. Ah's battle plan was to rely on Kenmet to defend, but he could not let the enemy attack blindly. Therefore, he would arrange his army to fight. He did not expect to be able to repel the Uruk Legion in this battle. Regardless of whether his army retreated or was defeated, there would still be a defensive line to rely on. Therefore, he still left enough troops to defend the castle and fortifications. The most unexpected thing about the battle during the day was that the Supreme Mage Uriya was the first to be killed, and he was killed while protecting a boss. No matter what kind of enmity he had with he had died on the battlefield for the country. Sent people to return his relics and wrote a memorial to the pharaoh praising his achievements. The Empire of Igut would also hold a special memorial ceremony for him. Sat on a chair with his eyes closed. He was carried directly into the meeting hall in Kenmet. Before he opened his eyes, the main generals of the several legions had gathered here. George told the 2 9th-level supreme mages in detail what had happened on the battlefield. There were also special priests on the battlefield who recorded the information. Ricard and Vord watched the scene of Julian's death and were shocked speechless for a long time. George sighed, "If I had been standing in Julian's position, I would not have been able to defend myself at that time and would not have escaped death." Vord frowned and said, "If I had been alert, I might have been able to block that punch, but I would have been unable to control my body and would have fallen from the sky. If there were no masters to rescue me, I would have most likely fallen to my death." Ricard added, "Julian used his life to block it. Enkidu did not fall into the ranks of the priests behind him. He probably injured Enkidu more or less." The power of this supreme warrior's first 3 punches were beyond imagination. It was obvious that he came prepared. The 3rd punch was clearly intended to kill Commander-in-Chief on the spot. Fortunately, Lord Commander-in-Chief is also the strongest among the strong and did not let him succeed. Otherwise, we would have been defeated before the battle even started. The head of the Legion of Isis, the 8th-level Supreme Warrior Ankh, was shocked and sighed, "I am known as the chief warrior of the Temple of Isis, but even I can't throw a punch like that. But I can imagine his strength. This is the most powerful explosive impact and extremely exhausting." After 3 punches, he was already tired, but he still fought with 3 supreme warriors for a whole day. At the end, he was still able to suddenly exert his strength. "It's terrifying." Rod Dick's eyes widened. "I have seen Gabriel fight with my own eyes. I thought that he was almost invincible. I didn't expect to see the horror of Enkidu today. There are many more warriors than mages on the continent, but it is extremely difficult to practice body arts to the highest level. There are far fewer 9th level supreme warriors than 9th level mages. At this time, who had been silent for a long time, suddenly opened his eyes and said, "This battle is already the best we could have expected. Although our casualties are nearly 40% higher than the enemy's, we are not defeated. Gilgamesh has tested our strength. If we want to continue fighting, we can only attack the defensive line with brute force. If we want to hold on, we must fight a war of attrition." Rod-Dik reminded, "We are relying on the rear of our country to fight, so of course it is advantageous to fight a war of attrition. But don't forget that the Uruk Legion has already occupied a large area of land. If we drag this out for a long time, they will be able to establish a base and even manage the occupied area as their own territory. By that time, our advantage will not be as great." Nodded, "Therefore, this war cannot be ended in a short time, but if it is dragged out until next year, we will be in a more passive position. Therefore, not only do we have to defend, we have to launch a counterattack to prevent Gilgamesh from using his main forces to manage the land in the rear. If the Geb Legion can also reach the Kenmet defensive line, this battle will be easier to fight." Rod-Dik smiled bitterly, "It will take about half a month for the Geb Legion to reach here. Gilgamesh will not wait for us. He will attack Kenmet very soon." Looked at Rod-Dik and said slowly, "As far as I know, the Cape States have stockpiled a batch of scrolls. This time, transfer them to the front line and distribute them to the soldiers." Nero was the most outstanding scroll maker in the history of the Empire of Igut. After becoming a supreme mage, he served as the chief priest of the Cape States for more than 40 years. Some of the scrolls he made were given away to others, while others were sold at a high price. After Rod-Dik became the governor of the city, he sealed the scrolls that Nero had left behind in the shrine and deliberately collected other relics for future use. Was naturally aware of this and had instructed Rod-Dik to bring the scrolls to the battlefield. Rod-Dik said in a low voice, "The scrolls are a one-time use item. Once they are used, they will be gone. We have to be careful when we use them." Sighed, "Now that the soldiers are already at the gates of the city, Enkidu is invincible. If he were to lead an elite force to attack Kenmet, do you think that 20-foot-tall, 8-foot-wide city wall would be able to stop him? If he were to break through the defensive line and open up a gap for the Uruk Legion, the consequences would be dire. If we don't use the scrolls now, then when?" Rod-Dik nodded, "Fine, I will immediately transfer all the scrolls in the shrine to the front line. I have been collecting Nero's relics and scrolls in preparation for this day." Then added, "Not only the scrolls in the shrine, you should also have a collection of scrolls, including those obtained by the Ramos clan. Put it all on the account of Igut and the Cape States." Ankh asked, "Lord Commander, are you planning to use the scrolls to deal with Enkidu? But the scrolls are dead, and the people are alive. How do you know which part of the frontline Enkidu will break through?" Shook his head, "Of course I don't know. That's why we need enough scrolls. Send a group of people who can use these scrolls to the front of Kenmet's walls. Every 3 people will form a group. We don't need to be able to kill Enkidu in one fell swoop. As long as we can slow him down for a while, the nearby defenders will be able to regroup and attack." Ankh asked again, "Lord Commander, who do you want to distribute the scrolls to?" As he said this, he glanced at the 2 supreme mages beside him. Said, "I want to find a group of warriors who have undergone the second awakening of power to defend the front of the front line. After seeing Enkidu's punch during the day, the supreme mages in our army must be on high alert." Ankh and the rest looked at each other. Asked, "What's wrong, is there a problem?" Ankh smiled bitterly, "Lord Commander, according to your requirements, we simply cannot find that many qualified warriors. In theory, advanced warriors can undergo the second awakening of power. If they succeed, they can practice basic magic, meditate, and master magic. When they reach a certain level, they can use the intermediate scrolls. If they are advanced warriors who have successfully undergone the second awakening of power and have practiced magic to a certain level, they can use the advanced scrolls. But this is only in theory. In reality, the second awakening of power is not easy to succeed, and it requires a supreme mage to hold a special ceremony. The ceremony of the second awakening of power was held by the Holy Maiden Maria herself. For ordinary warriors, this kind of opportunity is too rare. The status of supreme warriors is noble, and if they want to, they generally have the opportunity to experience this ceremony. But how many supreme warriors are there? How can an ordinary advanced warrior, especially a civilian one, invite a supreme mage to hold a ceremony for them? Moreover, the number of supreme mages is even smaller. For example, in the Cape States, since the death of Nero until the arrival of Julian, there has not been a supreme mage in the last 30 years. For advanced warriors, unless they are of particularly noble birth and have the qualifications and face to invite a supreme mage to hold a ceremony for them, it is difficult for ordinary warriors to have such an opportunity. And even if there is such an opportunity, it may not necessarily succeed, so the proportion of warriors who have successfully undergone the second awakening of power is quite small. In order to use the advanced scrolls, one must be a supreme warrior who has undergone the second awakening of power, and there are not many in the army. There are only a few dozen advanced warriors who have learned low-level magic, and they can only use the intermediate scrolls, which may not be of much use. Ah realized that this plan is a bit presumptuous based on his own habits, so he said, "It seems that we have to send mages to the city walls. There will be groups of 3 at a certain distance, and in case of emergency, use the scrolls. 1 attack scroll, 1 defense scroll, and 1 spatial lock scroll. Enkidu is too fast, and we have to use spatial lock magic to hit him." Chapter 141. Soldiers at the gates. Ricard thought for a moment and said, "There are currently more than 200 mages in the army, all of whom are advanced mages. We can send 30 groups of 90 mages to the city wall. Each group must be protected by a team of warriors." Rod Dick smiled bitterly. "Where do we get so many high-grade scrolls? Even if I empty the inventory of the Shrine of Cape, you can only send 25 groups of mages at most. If that's the case, I can still gather attack and defense scrolls. However, if every set of scrolls needs to have spatial locking effects, I'm afraid that most of these scrolls will be intermediate scrolls." All nodded and said, "Then let's do it this way. Send 25 groups of 75 mages with scrolls to the walls. If Enkidu leads the charge to break through, use the scrolls to stop his first wave of attacks. The surrounding defenders will gather quickly. Even if we don't use it this way, if Gilgamesh launches an all-out attack on the city, if all of these scrolls are suddenly activated, it will be enough to heavily injure his siege troops." Draco patted Rod Dick on the shoulder. "City Lord, you're truly far-sighted. Scrolls have never been issued to the various armies of the continent, yet you've managed to hoard a batch of them. They've come in handy today." Next, they discussed the deployment of the battle line. Ah pointed to the sand table and said, "Kenmet is too small after all. If the army is crowded in the city, the cavalry and chariots will not be of much use. Once the enemy soldiers broke through the defense and killed their way in, the city would be trampled on and suffer heavy losses. A single stone could kill many people. Corps commanders, how do you think we should set up our defenses?" Upon hearing the commander-in-chief's tone and looking at the situation on the battlefront, Draco and Vades tactfully requested to leave the city to set up a defense. Ah then split the chariots and heavy cavalry into 2 groups, and assigned them to the 2 commanders. They set up camps on both sides of Kenmet town's defensive line, coordinating with Kenmet. Ah also ordered the erection of hard crossbows and artillery carriages on the city walls to carry out a special performance of defending the city. When the arrangements were almost complete, he asked the 2 supreme mages to summon the priests to set up a magic array to perform healing and blessing magic for himself, Gabriel, and Medanzo. That night, Ah sat in the hall. Countless soft rays of light fell on him. The tearing pain in his body and the soreness in his bones gradually subsided. As expected of a 9th-level supreme mage. While Ah Yu was deep in meditation, he somehow saw Maria again. The god's tear on her staff was emitting a golden radiance. Her blessing from Isis was the most gentle comfort in his heart. On the same night, in the Uruk Legion's camp, in the largest tent, a dozen or so mages also formed a magic array. Gilgamesh sat opposite Enkidu, holding his staff as he cast a blessing and healing magic. All sorts of radiance fell on Enkidu's body, his tall and sturdy figure was as dazzling as a god. The golden gauntlet had already been taken off, and the one on his right hand had a large crack. Gilgamesh sighed as he looked at it. This gauntlet will be difficult to repair. Fortunately, I made 2 pairs, so you can change to another one. The snake scale armor isn't damaged much, and it can be repaired in 10 days. You can continue to wear it on the battlefield. Enkidu did not close his eyes to meditate. Holding a large cup of wine, he said, "Back then, without this armor and gauntlet, I could have killed Humbaba all the same." Gilgamesh gently shook his head. "Why not use the armor and weapons? I saw the power of your 3 punches today. If you had used the giant shield and broadsword that you often use, although they are powerful, they would not have been as agile and fast." Enkidu said bitterly, "I didn't win today because I didn't complete the plan I had laid out beforehand. I didn't kill Commander Igut with my 3rd punch. I didn't expect that Ah Xiang to be so difficult to fight. He was lucky to escape from me this time, but next time he won't be so lucky." When Gilgamesh was thinking, he habitually narrowed his slender eyes. "You and I aren't the only strong people on the continent. Ah Xiang was originally just a second-rate magician, but he was on the same side as the goddess. His origin is not simple. Now that he has become the commander of Igut's battlefield, he must have something extraordinary. Today, when he suddenly buried you under the mountain, even I was shocked." Enkidu angrily said, "The first time I saw him, he was with the goddess. The second time I saw him, he actually injured me." Gilgamesh smiled and advised, "There are many good women in the world, why do you like such a goddess? If you want to prove yourself, killing Humbaba is enough. Today, Ah Xiang injured you, but you wanted to kill him first. Besides, your injury is not serious, so you don't need to be angry. The 2 armies are not fighting. If you meet this person again, you must be careful. Don't give him the opportunity to use his methods." Enkidu said with some doubt, "Isn't he a supreme warrior? Why was he once a magician? That move of his today, what was it exactly?" Gilgamesh narrowed his eyes again. "It's a very simple method." He filled a spatial artifact with stones and suddenly piled them all up. This person is indeed a supreme warrior. After the second awakening of his power, he has reached the peak of mastering magic. He can even use a spatial artifact. Enkidu frowned, "Never heard of him." Gilgamesh said lightly, "Have you heard of a mage like me before? Since ancient times, there have been so many geniuses on the continent who have perseverance, fortuitous encounters, and luck at the same time. Some secrets are known to the gods, but mortals can also explore them. He may just be a lucky person with a unique achievement." Enkidu said in a deep voice, "I know your temper. If the situation is different, you would like to make friends with this kind of person. But now, I must kill him." Gilgamesh reached out and patted Enkidu on the shoulder. "We all want to kill him, but in the next battle, you must first avoid Ah Xiang's position and focus on the weak points of the city wall. There is also another matter." Enkidu took a big gulp of wine, put down the cup and asked, "What is it?" Gilgamesh replied, "Scrolls. Nero was once the most famous scroll maker on the continent. He has been the chief priest in Cape States for more than 40 years. I heard that both the father and son Drick deliberately kept the offensive and defensive scrolls made by Nero. I'm afraid there are a lot of them. If we throw them all out, it will cause us great losses. I guess Ah Xiang will also use them to defend himself, so you must be careful not to suffer a loss." Enkidu snorted coldly, "The scrolls are nothing more than magic. When have I ever been afraid of them? Besides, even if there are scrolls, you must have the opportunity to use them. Gilgamesh said, "If it is a one-on-one fight, I believe no mage will have the opportunity to use the scrolls in front of you. But this is a war between armies, and we don't know who will suddenly use the scrolls. So be careful." Enkidu said, "Even if there is a batch of high-level scrolls, will I just stand there and let them attack? Besides, the city wall is so long, how many mages can they send with scrolls? Even if they do, each section of the wall has a few mages with scrolls. Do they want to kill me? Lord Drick, do you still not trust me?" Gilgamesh laughed, "My brother, I trust you as much as I trust myself. I'm telling you this because I hope you know what to do. This is also the reason why I told you to avoid Asyang when attacking the city." One of Enkidu's gloves was cracked, and the snake scale armor was slightly damaged. However, the scorpion shell armor that Ah Chuan was wearing was already broken after the battle, and could not be repaired. Repairing such an armor was not as simple as replacing the damaged scorpion shell. It required magic to refine it again. Fortunately, the scorpion shell armor worn by Madanzo was not seriously damaged. Ah Xiang dismantled his own armor and replaced the intact scorpion shell with another armor. It took him a few days to repair it, and he could finally wear it on the battlefield. This was the best armor he had. Not only could it resist the slashes of swords and spears, but it also had excellent magic defense. In the face of a terrible opponent like Enkidu, it was more important to save his life, and all preparations must be made. Ah Xiang naturally wanted to buy time and wait for the Geb Legion to arrive. If Gilgamesh did not launch an attack, he would not move. These days, he had been patrolling the line of defense. On this day, he climbed the city wall with the supreme mage Ricard, focusing on the positions of the groups of mages with scrolls. They chatted as they walked. Ricard mentioned the legend of the continent's #1 warrior, Enkidu, which aroused Ah's interest. This supreme mage obviously knew a lot of inside information, some of which I had never heard before. Enkidu was not the head of the Uruk Legion, nor was he the commander of the frontline, nor was he the general of any army. His position was the same as Madanzo's, only the captain of Gilgamesh's guards, but his status was no less than any warrior on the continent. As a mage, Gilgamesh was able to shoot an earth-shattering arrow on the battlefield not only because of his high magic attainments, but also because of his innate divine strength. When Enkidu was young, he was a wild hunter in the mountains. Some people even said that he was a highland giant and was also born with divine strength. He hunted wild beasts in the outskirts of the mountains, and he had a bad temper. He had never lost in a fight. When Gilgamesh was young, he was fond of hunting, and he met Enkidu by chance in the mountains. At that time, they were still children in their teens. It was said that Enkidu had only been defeated once in his life, and that was when he was young. He was beaten to the ground by Gilgamesh, and the two became good friends. It was also said that the two children wrestled for a long time without a clear winner, and they both admired each other very much. Gilgamesh, the son of the governor, brought Enkidu back to Uruk and sent him to take care of Enkidu. He taught him how to eat and dress like a noble, learned all kinds of etiquette, and hired a teacher to teach him how to read and write. However, Enkidu was a natural warrior. He was not interested in reading at all, but he loved to learn martial arts. Some people said that he became a supreme warrior at the age of 16, and some were even more exaggerated. It was said that Enkidu defeated a supreme warrior in Uruk at the age of 14. In short, he became a supreme warrior at an age even younger than Ah. However, it was clear that he became a 9th-level warrior at the age of 21. Enkidu was 34 years old this year, and Gilgamesh was 2 years older than him. No one knew exactly when Gilgamesh became a 9th-level supreme mage, but they were both rare geniuses in the continent. After saying this, Ricard looked at Ah and said, "After watching the battle a few days ago, I have a feeling that Enkidu seems to be targeting you, Commander-in-Chief. You have to be careful on the battlefield. I have a question, if it is convenient for you, Commander-in-Chief, can you tell me?" Ah hurriedly said, "Thank you for the reminder. Dear High Priest of the Empire, if you have any questions, please ask." Ricard smiled and said, "You used a magical spatial artifact to fill it with boulders and suddenly poured it down, almost killing Enkidu. I was stunned by this move. May I ask how you did it?" Also smiled and said, "Although spatial artifacts are precious, it is not unusual for me to have one or two. The scrolls left by Nero are strange. I am afraid that some of them are just to confirm his own ideas, not for practical use. There is a kind of scroll that allows people to control the operation of magical space. I really admire this master's wonderful ideas." Ricard said, "I almost forgot, you also have Nero's relics in your hands. Many of the scrolls made by this master are really interesting. You are a supreme warrior who has successfully undergone the second awakening of power. If you are willing to train your magic power to the extreme, it is not impossible to use spatial artifacts. But if that is the case, I am afraid that it will delay the practice of body arts. After all, a person's energy is limited." Smiled humbly and said, "I will remember your words." After the battle ended in a draw, did not move his troops, allowing Gilgamesh to calmly prepare for the siege. In the rear, Pharaoh received the battle report and the news of the death of Supreme Mage Julian. He sent a messenger to Kenmit to reward the army and encourage the soldiers to fight bravely. At the same time, the messenger also conveyed Pharaoh's oral instructions, asking and the other generals when they would attack and repel the Uruk Legion. Although the intention of the messenger was to encourage and reward the army, such a question also hinted that Pharaoh was slightly dissatisfied with the front lines. The messenger also mentioned that when Pharaoh was discussing with the ministers, he expressed his desire to supervise the front lines and see how the Igut army repelled the so-called strongest legion on the continent. If Pharaoh personally went to the front lines, it would naturally boost the morale of the army, but would rather he did not come. If Pharaoh was here, not only would he have to split some of his forces to deal with and protect him, it would also be troublesome if Pharaoh was involved when commanding and mobilizing the army. Sent the recording of Enkidu's charge to the messenger and instructed the messenger to let Pharaoh see it with his own eyes. No one knew how the Pharaoh felt after seeing the image recorded by the magic. In short, he did not mention coming to the front line to supervise the battle. Instead, he sent messengers to reward the three supreme warriors, Gabriel and Metatro, and told them to hold the line of defense and not to act rashly before the Geb Legion arrived. 10 days after the first battle of the Uruk Legion, the Geb Legion was still 3 days away from Kenmit. Gilgamesh did not give any more time to wait. Early in the morning, scouts reported that there was movement in the Uruk Legion's camp. Not long after the sun rose, the Uruk Legion arrived outside Kenmit. In a siege battle, although the defending side had an advantage in defense, the attacking side also had an advantage to take advantage of. The walls were dead, but the soldiers were alive. They could flexibly set up battle formations and attack the enemy's weak points. The Uruk Legion untied the horses from the chariots and loaded them with bags of sand and stones. They lined up at the front of the battle formation. Not only could they block arrows, there were also sword and shield soldiers pushing the chariots closer to the walls in an attempt to create a slope for them to charge. Behind the chariots loaded with sand and stones was another row of modified chariots. On top of the chariots, there were arrow towers that could be used to face the Igut soldiers on the walls. In addition, the Uruk Legion also used giant logs to build a high platform. The top of the platform was twice the height of the walls. Gilgamesh did not use magic to fly in the air. Instead, he placed a large purple umbrella in the middle of the platform. He sat on a chair with Enkidu standing beside him. Looked at Enkidu from afar and was secretly amazed. In the battle 10 days ago, it was impossible for this supreme warrior to come out unscathed. But today, on the battlefield, he appeared to be in high spirits. The aura he exuded was at its peak, and it was even more terrifying than 10 days ago. Had only recovered a few days ago under the care of the 2 9th-level supreme mages. On the other hand, Gabriel and Medanzo could not enter the battlefield today. The two supreme warriors were either injured or ill, but their strength was extremely depleted, and they were currently unable to fight with magic power. The fact that had recovered so quickly showed that his body was made of iron. On the other hand, Enkidu looked even stronger than iron. When saw Gilgamesh's formation, he stood on the tower and said in a clear voice, "Soldiers of the Uruk Legion, why did you come all the way to a foreign land to die? Hurry up and return to your families and continue living in peace and contentment." On the platform, Gilgamesh laughed and said, "Ah, are you not a general but an orator? Do you want to win with words when the enemy is at the gates? If I don't retreat, are you going to surrender?" When he finished speaking, he stood up from his chair, drew his bow, and shot an arrow at This time, it was not a sneak attack. Everyone in front of the two armies could clearly see the roars of thousands of wild bulls coming from the wilderness. Did not respond with an arrow. Suddenly, a huge curtain of light appeared on the tower. In front of the curtain of light, a cloud of smoke and dust condensed into an invisible armor. Gilgamesh's arrow caused the smoke and dust to explode and the light curtain to tremble, but it was not affected. This was a battle to defend the city. In addition to the 75 mages sent to the wall, there were hundreds of mages behind the tower. They formed a protective array together, with a 9th-level supreme mage in charge of the array. They had long been ready to go. Although Gilgamesh's arrow was powerful, it could not directly hurt at such a distance. The defense of the tower was the most stable. Chapter 142. The most extravagant counterattack. The supreme mage accompanying the defense line was Vord. He did not float in the air. Perhaps he had learned his lesson from Julian's death. He stayed behind the watchtower. Gilgamesh laughed heartily when his arrow failed. Did Dong use such a huge formation just to receive my arrow? I'd like to see how strong the walls of Kenmet are. The war drums thundered. 40 personal guards carried the platform and pushed forward to the left, avoiding the position of Dong's watchtower. The siege troops rushed forward. The ropes of the cannons on the walls were taut and the bows were already loaded. When the enemy's siege vehicles entered the city, the first round of flying stones rained down from the sky. The arrows from the watchtowers passed through the flying stones and entered the city. Some were hit by arrows and fell off the walls, while others were hit by flying stones and fell under the chariots. The battle began once again. If the enemy was allowed to push the chariots without any qualms, the walls of Kenmet would soon be flattened. The Uruk Legion's chariots were obstructed by the flying stones and arrows, but the cannons and ballistae had blind spots. The siege vehicles passed through the densely packed stones and reached the bottom of the walls. The defending soldiers had to lean out of the walls in order to fire. This also exposed themselves and made them the target of the enemy's firepower. Carts of sand and stones were piled up at the bottom of the walls, but they flowed down like quicksand. This was one of the earth elemental magic spells, quicksand. At this moment, it could still be used to stop the siege. Sounds of chanting could be heard from the top of the walls. Various flames and wind blades rained down. The Uruk soldiers pushing the chariots raised their shields to defend. Many of them were hit by the magic spells and cried out in pain. The mages on the walls also helped in the battle. They could attack the enemies at the bottom of the walls. They stood a little further away from the battlements, protected by the warriors in front of them. Amidst the beating of the war drums, the chariots of the Uruk Legion with the watchtowers also approached. Both sides exchanged arrows, and only the sound of the arrows piercing through the air could be heard. A screen of light appeared around the watchtowers, and the incoming arrows lost their power and fell to the ground. The mages of the Uruk Legion also advanced along with the front line, hiding behind the chariots and casting magic. Gilgamesh said to Enkidu from the high platform, "As expected, Amon has sent mages to the wall in groups of 3 to help the warriors defend the city." Enkidu sneered, "The number of mages is much smaller than that of warriors. Their greatest use is not to fight on the front line. They are desperate." Gilgamesh reminded, "Just as I guessed, the mages may be waiting for you with the scrolls." Enkidu, "It's just a shell. If it's broken, it'll all be broken." Gilgamesh smiled faintly. You don't have to be so anxious. Let me see how tough Zhao's shell on the city wall is. 40 personal guards carried a high platform made of huge wood and walked around the city from the rear of the battle formation. Gilgamesh avoided the tower in the middle of the city and drew his bow and arrow towards the city wall. The distance of an arrow did not depend only on the crossbow or the bow, but also on the archer. The arrows on the city wall did not hit Gilgamesh on the platform, but Gilgamesh's arrow landed heavily on the city wall with a roar. The arrow shattered the stones on the front of the city wall, causing a large piece to collapse in an instant. Several Igut soldiers fell down. Sounds of chanting could be heard from both sides of the gap. Several mages worked together to cast the wall-fortifying spell, and the fallen stones were rolled up and the gap was temporarily repaired. Gilgamesh smiled and did not get entangled. The platform under his feet continued to move forward, and he fired another arrow not far away. Several soldiers holding shields were sent flying by the arrow. The protective shields of the 3 mages behind them were also shattered by the arrow. One of them was pierced, and the other 2 were thrown behind the city wall by the surging force of the arrow. It was unknown whether they were dead or alive. Gilgamesh leisurely shot back and forth with his arrows. Although he did not use his full strength, the power of each arrow was still astonishing. Every time he shot a different place, he would always be able to achieve something. If it wasn't a gap in the city wall, several soldiers would fall, or a catapult would be overturned, causing panic on the city wall. The besieging soldiers found a gap in the wall and took the opportunity to launch a fierce attack. In order to plug the gap, the defending army suffered heavy losses. Ai, who was watching the battle from the watchtower, broke out in a cold sweat. Gilgamesh's arrows were so powerful. Fortunately, this spell could not be cast endlessly, and it consumed a lot of magic power. Therefore, Gilgamesh did not use his full strength and only shot every once in a while. Otherwise, there would be no need to defend the city wall, and it would be better to just charge into battle. The magic formation that Vord was presiding over also began to operate. The supreme mage slowly flew up from behind the city wall. He did not fly too high, nor too close to the front. He circled around the city, following Gilgamesh's position. There was always an invisible barrier protecting the top of the city wall, and the situation was finally stabilized. However, if they continued to fight like this, they would always be on the receiving end. The Uruk Legion also set up cannons in between the watchtowers, and stones rained down on the walls of Kenmet. They were indeed the most powerful legion on the continent, and the accuracy of their cannons was obviously better than that of the Igut soldiers. Ai, who was on the watchtower, took out his bow and shot a dozen arrows. He overturned 2 sandstone chariots, 1 cannon, and 1 watchtower, but the arrows that he shot were all blocked by the magic formation of the enemy camp. Enkidu, who was beside Gilgamesh, had yet to make a move. Ai sighed and quietly turned to leave the watchtower. The supreme mage Ricard beside him had also disappeared. There were only a few thousand soldiers defending Kenmet. If they continued to resist like this, it would only be a matter of time before they fell. It all depended on when Enkidu would choose to launch his assault. On the high platform, Enkidu had been paying attention to Gilgamesh's arrows the whole time. He seemed to have turned a blind eye to the fierce battle on the city walls. He whispered to Gilgamesh, "My lord, you have attracted the attention of their magic formations and supreme mages." Gilgamesh nodded, "You can make your move now." Enkidu, the chariots and cavalrymen on the left and right flanks of Kenmet should have already moved out. They are trying to outflank our army. Gilgamesh, the chess pieces are all laid out in front of me. I have long prepared for this. This is a tough battle. As he spoke, he suddenly shot 3 arrows in a row, each faster than the last. All of them carried an unstoppable force as they flew towards a single point on the city wall. A loud roar resounded, and the invisible curtain of light that enveloped the city suddenly became extremely bright. Vord, who was floating behind the city wall, waved his staff and blocked the 3 arrows with all his might. The entire section of the city wall seemed to tremble, and the soldiers on the wall lost their footing and fell to the ground. Everyone thought that Gilgamesh was going to choose this place to launch his main attack. Enkidu also jumped down from the watchtower. As soon as he saw Enkidu make his move, Vord immediately flew back, his figure disappearing from behind the city wall. This was what Amon had told him long ago. He did not dare to let a supreme mage use his avatar of blood to block the fist of the strongest warrior on the continent. He had to put some distance between them in order to launch an effective counterattack. However, Enkidu did not directly rush to the front. He ran wildly behind the battle formation, bypassing the watchtower and coming to the other side of the city wall at a speed faster than flying. Then, he turned around and went straight to the bottom of the city wall. From a distance, he stamped his feet and leaped high, smashing his fist into the wall with a golden light. Behind him, a group of Uruk cavalrymen rushed out and followed the supreme warrior to break through the city's defenses. This was the place where Gilgamesh's second arrow hit. The 3 mages guarding this place had already been killed, and the nearby mages had retreated to fill the gap. However, this was also the place where the defense was relatively weak. The supreme mage holding the scroll was not a supreme mage. After all, the scroll had to be used by someone. Facing Enkidu, how could anyone not panic? Enkidu's speed was so fast that it was almost an illusion. As soon as he swung his fist, it was as if he was right in front of them. The mage holding the spatial lock scroll had unfurled it too early. The space in front of the city wall was distorted, and many arrows were frozen in place in an instant. Then, they slowly fell to the ground, including the crossbow bolts fired at Enkidu by the defending soldiers. The confined space was soon torn apart by a ball of golden light, leaving cracks on the ground below. The mage holding the supreme offensive scroll was a little slow. This scroll was a wind element scroll. The wind blades danced in the air, even leaving scratches on the city wall. The besieging soldiers nearby screamed and fell. But Enkidu passed through the edge of the flying wind blades. Under the brilliance of his fist, the wind blades scattered in all directions. Occasionally, a few of them were annihilated by the light emitted by the snake scales. The supreme warrior punched the city wall heavily. The mage holding the supreme defensive scroll did not even have time to unfurl it. Half of the city wall collapsed in an instant. Smoke and dust exploded, obscuring the surrounding vision. The soldiers on both sides were thrown to the ground by the flying air. At this moment, a deafening clap of thunder and flames rose. The other 2 groups of mages, one on the left and one on the right, had already thrown out their scrolls. Although they could not see Enkidu, they knew that he was in the smoke. As the scroll unfurled, a loud shout was heard. A burly figure flew out, somersaulted in the air, and fell far away outside the city. Enkidu did not stop at all. Using the recoil force of his punch, he flew back before landing, and punched again in the air, dispersing the distorted space entangling his figure. Finally, a spatial lock scroll unfurled by one of the mages worked. Unfortunately, Enkidu was prepared and was not trapped in place. Amir, who was watching the battle from afar, almost vomited blood. It was as if Enkidu already knew the tactics of Igut's legion against him. With one blow, he collapsed half of the city wall, and then flew back using the recoil force. With his speed and strength, even a spatial lock scroll could not stop him. What's more, the 2 groups of mages on both sides had already unfurled their scrolls and concentrated their attacks on the half of the city wall that Enkidu had collapsed. As a result, the already crumbling section of the city wall completely collapsed, helping Enkidu instead. On both sides of the gap in the city wall, there were still many soldiers lying on the ground. Some may have been injured, some may have been knocked to the ground by the power of Amir's punch, but now they were killed by the attack scrolls unfurled by the mages. In other words, the scrolls thrown by the 2 groups of mages not only did not hurt Enkidu, but also helped Enkidu to collapse the city wall and kill the defending soldiers. No matter how good Amir's plan was, he still needed people to carry it out, not to mention that he had no other choice. Mages were never suited for close combat. Even if these noble lords were not afraid of the #1 warrior of the continent, they would not be able to cooperate seamlessly. The slightest mistake would result in the loss of the desired result, not to mention that Enkidu was already prepared. Enkidu flew back to the ground. The heavy cavalry behind him had already caught up, and the gap in the city wall in front of him had also opened up. He shouted again and rushed into the gap between the two sections of the city wall. The morale of the Uruk Legion was greatly boosted. They surrounded the city wall and launched an all-out attack, cooperating with Enkidu's breakthrough. At this moment, Amir shouted, "Enkidu, I've been waiting for you to die for a long time." Where was Amir? He stood on the roof of a building behind the gate tower and could clearly see the semicircular defensive line in front of him. Countless arrows flew over the city wall and into the city. There were also stones wrapped in flames that fell inside and outside the city wall. Those were the stones fired by the Uruk Legion's siege cannons. It was a spectacular sight to behold. The mages were also fighting. From time to time, a mist of ice would extinguish the flames on the stones and a twisting force would change the direction of the stones so that they would not hit the soldiers below. The siege had already begun. Amir stood on the roof and watched quietly. Around the tall building he was standing on, there was a group of cavalrymen in bright armor silently lined up, as if they were waiting for something. Amir knocked an arrow with a solemn expression. The 9th level mage Ricard stood behind him, holding a staff in his left hand and a spatial artifact in his right. He was meditating with his eyes closed. Both of them had been preparing for a long time. As soon as Enkidu's silhouette appeared at the gap in the city wall where the smoke and dust had yet to settle, Adele fired an arrow. The arrow was initially silent and extremely fast, but when it neared the city wall, it suddenly slowed down. The sound of something slamming against the wall could be heard and the surroundings were filled with flashes of blue light. Countless sharp icicles appeared and gathered towards Enkidu. Even the air turned cold. The arrow made a hissing sound as it suddenly sped up between the icicles. Like the tip of a giant mountain, there was no way for Enkidu to avoid it. This was an arrow that Amir had shot with all his strength. In addition, a 9th level mage had infused his magic into the arrow. In order to enhance the effect of the ice, Ricard had also taken out a spatial artifact filled with water. If Gilgamesh and Enkidu could cooperate with each other, then Amir and Ricard could also do the same. They were just waiting for the moment when Enkidu appeared. Enkidu rushed into the city and was already prepared for all attacks. He immediately punched Amir's arrow with a loud bang. The force of the punch shattered the countless icicles flying towards him into powder. Ricard gritted his teeth and raised his staff. The dancing ice froth condensed into a huge ice shell, blocking the gap in the city wall and covering Enkidu inside. The ice wall instantly ignited with fire. The flames changed from orange to blue and then to pale gold. This magic was very similar to the effect of Nero's self-created scroll, Song of Ice and Fire. Azon had used this technique to kill the two-headed snake monster. At this moment, he was being used by a 9th level mage to deal with Enkidu. Enkidu was not as easy to deal with as the two-headed snake monster. He spun in place and waved his fists. His figure was like an invisible shadow. The snake scales on his body also emitted a bronze light, sweeping away all the flames around him. Suddenly, an arrow whistled in from outside the city, hitting the outer layer of the ice shell that had just condensed. With a crack, the entire ice shell cracked. It was Gilgamesh's arrow from afar. At the same time that Gilgamesh's arrow cracked the ice shell, Enkidu had already turned around and punched the ice shell from the inside. The most destructive power of the Song of Ice and Fire was the huge explosion caused by the flames in the thick layer of ice. However, at the moment when the explosion was about to happen, Gilgamesh's arrow and Enkidu's fist hit the ice shell at the same time. The ice shell shattered and Enkidu was sent flying. Behind Enkidu, a huge explosion sounded. Ice and flames scattered in all directions. The air even swept away the Uruk cavalry that was charging towards the city wall. Then, the flames were extinguished. The broken ice and scattered rocks were gathered together by a strange force, forming a solid layer of frozen earth at the original gap in the city wall. The gap in the city wall was repaired. The frozen earth formed by the combination of rocks and ice was quite tough. A single slash could only leave a white mark. Furthermore, such a large piece of frozen earth could not be melted in a short period of time unless a concentrated fire element magic was used to attack it. Seeing that Enkidu had escaped, Liquid immediately used his magical power to repair such a section of the wall. This was the ability of a 9th-level Supreme Mage. It was simply amazing. Not only was the commotion in this area astonishing, but the entire defensive wall of Kenmet was also filled with magic power. Some of the Uruk Legion's siege vehicles were set ablaze, some were torn apart, and some were thrown high into the air onto the soldiers at the back. The soldiers who had reached the bottom of the city wall wailed in pain as they suffered heavy casualties. Ah's arrow was a signal. All the mages on the city wall were to activate all the attack scrolls in their hands as soon as they heard the arrow. They were to control the range of their attacks so as to not damage the city wall and only target the Uruk soldiers and chariots that were attacking the city. Some of the mages had already died, and the remaining mages activated their advanced attack scrolls. The siege troops that had just reached the bottom of the city wall were almost completely destroyed. Ah had a plan. Once Enkidu broke through a certain section of the city wall, the other mages would not be able to use their scrolls. Thus, he would use them all at the same time to deal heavy damage to the siege troops. Rod-Dik and his son had accumulated a lot of wealth over the years, and Ah was extremely generous with his spending. In the blink of an eye, almost all of it had been squandered away. No legion on the continent had ever seen anyone fight like this. If there was a general who could spend the most money on the battlefield in the blink of an eye, it would be Ah's magnificent feat. However, the money he spent was from the Cape States and Igut's military. In the end, it would still be counted in Igut's treasury. In any case, he did not feel any heartache. The Uruk Legion had yet to be defeated, but the siege troops at the front line had been completely routed. At this moment, a short horn sounded from the army formation in the distance. It was an order for the vanguard to regroup and temporarily retreat. They could not continue to attack under the messy city wall and had to regroup. The remaining siege troops left the corpses and damaged chariots on the ground and quickly retreated behind the arrow towers. The remaining arrow towers also slowly retreated out of the enemy's range to regroup. Today is the last night of the 9th month of September, and I wish you all the best in the month. The golden week of the 11th month is coming, and I wish all my readers a good rest and a good time. Chapter 143. Who is the God of War? Relying on the scrolls to repel the enemy's ferocious attacks, the exhausted mages finally retreated from the city walls. The warriors guarding the city also took the opportunity to take turns and fill in the reserves. Ah let out a long sigh. This method could only be used once. He had almost used up all the high-level attack scrolls. The most regrettable thing was that he did not manage to kill Enkidu. The #1 warrior on the continent was like an invincible god. He turned around and helped the swaying Ricard up. He then ordered his men to escort the Supreme Mage to rest. Ricard had used up all his strength in casting such powerful magic consecutively. He was already in his 90s, and even though he was usually full of energy, he felt very weak after expending so much magic power. On the platform, Gilgamesh's expression was extremely solemn. This was the heaviest loss the Uruk Legion had suffered so far. Even though he had expected Ah to use the scrolls to deal with Enkidu, he did not expect Ah to throw them all at the city walls without hesitation. This method could not be used again. Ah did not seem to care about the tough battle ahead. The eyes of this proud hero were dripping with blood. Enkidu had returned to Gilgamesh's side. His body was covered in scorch marks, and his snake-scale armor was damaged in many places. He picked up the giant shield and broadsword that he usually used. His eyes seemed to be burning with anger, and his entire body exuded a terrifying aura. In this round of battle, the Uruk Legion had lost nearly 600 elite siege soldiers. However, the casualties on the Igut side were not small either. Not counting the warriors guarding the city, just the mages alone had lost 20 men. Mages on the battlefield were different from ordinary mages. Ordinary mages had to undergo specialized training and rehearsals in order to cooperate with the army on the battlefield. It was not something that could be replaced by a random batch of mages in a short period of time. Just when the battlefield had temporarily calmed down, a slight tremor came from the wilderness in the distance. Chariots and cavalry were charging towards the Uruk Legion from both sides of the horizon. This was a strategy that Che had planned long ago. It would be very difficult to defend against the Uruk Legion's ferocious attack with just the walls of Kenmet. The troops stationed on both sides of the defensive line were to surround and attack the Uruk Legion once the battle began. Ba divided the chariots and cavalry into two groups. The commander on the left was Ankh, the commander of the Legion of Isis, while the commander on the right was Vladimir, the commander of the Horus Legion. Some time ago, when Pharaoh personally went into battle and also served as the head of the Horus Legion, the supreme general of the empire, Van Vlads, condescended to be the commander of the front line. Now that Pharaoh was not on the front line, he resumed his identity as the head of the legion. Gilgamesh had long been aware of As formation, and he had also expected such a counterattack from the left and right. The Uruk Legion's formation was in a horseshoe shape, with the flanks heavily defended while the front was a siege formation. The platform that Gilgamesh was on had already returned to the center of the formation, and the clerics had gathered below the platform and spread out on both sides to prepare for the enemy's attack. The greatest advantage of chariots and cavalry was their mobility and charging power. However, there was a flaw in their formation, and that was that it was difficult to turn in battle. If they slowed down, they would lose their advantage and would need to attack again under the cover of the infantry formation. Ba had left almost all of his infantry at Kenmet to defend the city. At this moment, the flanking formation was made up of chariots and cavalry, and there was no infantry formation to cover or follow. Ba's orders were simple. Ankh and Vladimir did not need to turn back when they attacked. They were to charge straight through the Uruk Legion's formation, and the retreat route would be their starting point. The left wing would circle back to the right wing's camp, and the right wing would circle back to the left wing's camp. With the mountain defensive line providing cover, they did not need to seek victory. They only needed to disrupt the enemy's camp and repel the attack. Therefore, the armies on the left and right wings did not clash head-on, but staggered to attack the rear of the Uruk Legion. That was where the retreating soldiers were resting and transporting flintstones and arrows to the front line. It was the weakest link. Of course, Gilgamesh couldn't let them succeed. The two flanks of the army spread out and launched a charge to meet them. The armies on the plains were like a few surging waves crashing into each other, and the sounds of battle could be heard once again. The gates of Kenmet suddenly opened, and a group of armored cavalry charged out. In the middle of the group was the commander-in-chief, Ba. Gilgamesh was dealing with the attacks from the rear, and the frontal attack had temporarily stopped. Ba would not let them rest. The situation had already turned into a battle of attrition, and he had to do his best to counterattack and destroy the siege towers and cannons on the front line. There were not many cavalry that charged out of the city, but they were all elites. Ba brought along his personal guards and 100 heavy cavalry that he had specially left behind. The commander of the defense was temporarily changed to Vord. The three armies charged at the Uruk Legion from different directions at the same time, and the most intense battle occurred on the left and right wings. Ba led his heavy cavalry and personal guards out, while the heavily armored warriors swung their axes and quickly destroyed many siege towers and cannons, supporting the battle on the flanks. Enkidu, who was on the high platform, suddenly let out an angry roar. He raised his giant shield and waved his broadsword as he leapt down. His heavy body smashed a shallow pit in the ground, and he charged towards Ba's direction without stopping. Behind him, a group of cavalry charged out on horseback. They were Gilgamesh's personal guards. Ba was a little surprised. Gilgamesh did not move from the high platform, but Enkidu had led his personal guards to attack the harassing troops that had charged out of the city. He did not pay attention to the more important battle on the flanks. Could it be that the governor was very confident in his generals? Or did he think that keeping an eye on Ba was more important than the entire battle? Ba's charge out of the city was just to harass the enemy, and he did not intend to entangle them for long. He wanted to rely on his speed and momentum to destroy the siege towers at the front lines, and then return to the city. But Enkidu's speed was too fast. In just a few strides, he was already in front of Ba. The giant shield in his hand even knocked over one of the siege towers that was blocking his way. Ba could not help but laugh bitterly when he saw Enkidu leaping into the air and swinging his heavy broadsword at him. Since when was he valued so highly by the #1 warrior of the continent? He actually enjoyed the same treatment as Humbaba. Ba's charge out of the city had been calculated. Enkidu had just escaped from the gap in the city wall, and even if he did not die, he would be injured. Even if he forced himself to attack, he would not be able to use his full strength. He did not expect the power of this sword to be even stronger than before. He could not count on his personal guards to block this sword. Enkidu's ferocity had ignited Ba's fighting spirit. He shouted loudly and leaped from his horse, waving his iron staff towards Enkidu in the air. With a loud bang, Enkidu threw the giant shield in his hand at the same time as he swung his sword. Like a meteor, the shield not only smashed into Ari's horse, but also several of Ari's bodyguards, who were standing beside him, fell to the ground and died on the spot. Just as leaped up and swung his staff, the cavalry behind him suddenly started chanting. They raised over 10 staffs at the same time. Countless rays of light fell on and Enkidu. The iron staff in Ba's hand instantly became so dazzling that no one dared to look at it. His flying speed was extremely fast, and he carried a mountain-like pressure. He was also surrounded by all kinds of invisible armor. This was a magic of blessings jointly launched by the priests. It gave Ba greater confidence and strength, and at the same time, gave him the most tenacious protection. Blessings could also be used to support attacks. The rays of light that fell on Enkidu had a completely opposite effect. The Supreme Warrior's movements were restrained, his reaction became slow, and he felt dizzy and drowsy. His body was also heavier than usual, making it difficult for him to move. Ba had 8 advanced mages put on bright light armor and disguised themselves as warriors. They hid their staffs in the cavalry and followed behind Ba under the protection of his personal guards. At this time, they suddenly joined forces to attack. The personal guards behind Enkidu also started chanting. Countless rays of light fell, some around Enkidu, but most of them gathered on his broadsword. The huge sword came with a violent impact of energy. It seemed that it was not affected by the magic of blessings. Even if it was affected, the power of the Supreme Warrior would be restrained very little. Took the initiative to meet him. His sword and staff clashed in mid-air, emitting an earth-shattering boom. Like a sledgehammer smashing against a great bell, the surrounding air rippled and distorted like ripples. The massive shockwave was like a howling tempest, as the vanguard cavalrymen of both sides were thrown off their mounts. The area beneath the two combatants swiftly transformed into a vast empty space. In the huge explosion of power, several scrolls flew up and unfolded. All kinds of magic of mass destruction roared, but the direction of the attack was not well controlled, and a puff of smoke rose outside the open space. The mages on both sides raised their staffs and waved wildly. The shields and weapons of the warriors raised a curtain of light to resist the attack of the scrolls. Before waving his staff in the air, Ayu had already thrown out 2 scrolls, not at Enkidu, but at the cavalrymen behind him, who were also hiding mages. If he could use scrolls, so could his enemies. The mages hidden among Enkidu's guards also threw out several scrolls at the cavalrymen behind Amir indiscriminately. After all, scrolls were not magic that mages could cast themselves. Although they did not consume the corresponding magic power, they had to lock on to the enemy's position to launch an attack. The impact of the clash between and Enkidu's staff was too strong. Although all the scrolls had been launched, they had deviated from their original attack position. The gorgeous magic attack looked dazzling, but it did not achieve the expected result. Enkidu's sword slashed at the iron staff. Ba felt the ringing in his ears for a long time, and the airflow in front of him even created sparks. He was shaken to the ground, and the solid soil under his feet instantly turned into soft quicksand. He had to use spatial and earth magic to prevent his feet from sinking in, but the ground that had hardened instantly began to crack like a spider's web. Shouted, "Retreat!" Then two scrolls flew towards Enkidu from behind. There were not many advanced attack scrolls left in Ba's hands. In the battle just now, some mages were killed before they could use the scrolls. Collected the scrolls they left behind and added a few more. This time, 8 mages charged out of the city with the scrolls just in case. The scrolls unfolded and there was another whistling sound of explosion, but it did not cause too much damage to Enkidu, because he had already left the place. The supreme warrior landed silently, his movements as light as a leopard cat, and his figure as fast as lightning. With such a burly physique and such a heavy broadsword, he flew straight towards Ba in the distance with a single step. Ba turned around and swung his staff to block. The staff did not directly collide with the broadsword, but a surge of energy erupted, and Ba was swept away by the huge impact. He did not take the sword head-on. Instead, he used a method of force dissipation in combination with spatial magic. He was like a milk boat swept up by a huge wave, and the scorpion shell armor on his body was shaken into several pieces. Enkidu, on the other hand, took another step and leapt high, holding the sword with both hands with a dazzling golden light, and slashed towards Ba's head from the air. Before the sword arrived, a huge sense of oppression had already enveloped Ba's body, with a strong energy binding effect. This was not magic, but the pinnacle of body arts. Ba had no other way to dodge. When the sword slashed down from the air, even the ground under his feet emitted a slight buzzing sound. Enkidu's determination was unwavering, abandoning everything else on the battlefield in order to kill Amon on the spot. Ba had always been cautious, and it was not that he did not make preparations when he charged out of the city. He had brought along all his elites, and he had even hidden 8 mages with scrolls in their hands. Even if the enemy counterattacked, he could throw out the scrolls as cover, disrupting the Uruk Legion's siege line and taking the opportunity to retreat back into the city. Wade D was on the city tower, leading the guards in a tight formation, ready to provide support at any time. Ba had no choice but to fight like this. Ankh and Blaze had already risked their lives to outflank the Uruk Legion. If he did not take the opportunity to disrupt the Uruk Legion's siege formation, he would miss the best opportunity. Whether or not he could repel the Uruk Legion's most powerful attack depended on this move. However, Ba did not expect that although Enkidu seemed to be injured, it did not affect his combat strength at all. On the contrary, the #1 warrior of the continent was completely enraged, and he was in a state of explosive rage. He picked up the broadsword that he had used to slay Humbaba, and his combat strength was unprecedentedly terrifying. With just 2 strikes, Ba was sent flying far away from the protection of the cavalry, and it became a one-on-one battle between the two of them again. Enkidu's personal guards were already locked in battle with Ba's cavalry. Even if someone came to the commander's rescue, how could they block Enkidu's earth-shattering strike? Only by standing in Ba's position could he truly feel how terrifying that strike was. Even if he wanted to perish together with Enkidu, he would not have the chance to use Tiamat's wrath. At the juncture of life and death, gritted his teeth and braced his chest, channeling all his mana to form an energy barrier around himself. Countless specks of light flickered on his staff, as he slowly and heavily raised it towards the sky. Right at this moment, a personal guard rushed in front of leaping up and raising his sword to block. Ba could not believe his eyes. Who could have arrived at this time? However, this person had indeed rushed over from the personal guards. When Ba and Enkidu's first strike, this person had already jumped off his horse. When Ba was sent flying by Enkidu's second strike, this person had already drawn his sword and rushed over at an unbelievable speed. When Enkidu's third strike came down, this person had jumped in front of Ba and blocked it for him. Looking at this person's reaction speed and explosive speed, he was definitely a supreme warrior. Furthermore, he was fearless in the face of Enkidu's might. Even the movement of his sword was not affected by the energy pressure in the slightest. Ba did not remember such a person among his personal guards. Even Madanzo could not do such a thing. However, this person was indeed wearing the armor of his personal guards. He had also rushed over from his personal guards. The helmet covered his facial features, and his face could not be seen clearly. The sword in the personal guard's hand was made of damask steel. The ridge of the sword was thick, long and tough. However, under Enkidu's golden broadsword, it was as thin as a blade of grass. It was basically a result that would shatter at the slightest touch. Ba wanted to order the guard to dodge. He could not meet the attack head-on, but the two swords had already collided in the air. An unbelievable thing happened. The slender warrior's sword actually blocked the broadsword that Enkidu used to chop off Humbaba's head. It was not damaged at all. What was even more strange was that the collision of the two swords did not make too much noise. The tsunami-like explosion of energy that should have appeared was submerged by a strange force. Even time seemed to have frozen in an instant. Enkidu and the personal guard landed at the same time. The continent's #1 warrior's eyes widened, and he roared madly. "Who are you?" There was no reply. Enkidu did not wait for his opponent to reply. The appearance of a new expert instead stimulated his fighting spirit. This time, he did not leap forward. Instead, he steadily advanced, and brandished his sword once again in a diagonal slash. Any enemy that stood in front of Ba, regardless of who it was, would be annihilated by Enkidu. This slash did not seem as powerful as the previous 3 slashes. However, the heavy broadsword faintly echoed with a sigh. The speed of the slash did not seem to be very fast, but the surrounding time and space seemed to have frozen. Only the broadsword slowly sliced through time and space. It was like the test of fate, unstoppable and unavoidable. The personal guard lightly stabbed out with his sword. The tip of his sword touched the ridge of the broadsword, and a crisp, ding, sound rang out. The sound was not loud, but it reverberated in Ba's mind. It was not inferior to any kind of spiritual attack. His heart felt like it was being clenched, and his whole body felt numb. He was standing behind the personal guard, but he still felt like this. It was evident that the power contained in this strike was immense. The personal guard retreated half a step before standing firm. Ba was involuntarily pushed back half a step by an invisible force. Enkidu's eyes shone with fanatical excitement. He shouted loudly. "Good!" He took half a step forward, and slashed out with his sword again. Another ding sound rang out. The personal guard blocked Enkidu's broadsword, and took another step back. Ba involuntarily followed suit. Enkidu and the personal guard's swordplay was simply not like a warrior's duel. It was purely a sword-swinging parry, without any technique or style. Several consecutive ding sounds rang out. Enkidu steadily advanced. The 11th Golden Week is here. I wish all my readers a happy holiday. If you want to read books on the internet during your free time, please spend this month's guaranteed monthly pass. Chapter 144. Let him go crazy. Was stunned. He could not figure out who the person in front of him was. But he was definitely not one of his personal guards. He looked to both sides and realized that he was already very far away from the battlefield. He seemed to be retreating step by step, but in fact, he was moving faster than a galloping horse. The explosion of energy flooded the surroundings, and even the scene in the distance was a blur. Came back to his senses and was about to raise his staff to join the battle when a familiar voice suddenly sounded in his mind, to think that I, the goddess of war of the Anunnaki, am no match for Enkidu. I can't use all my divine power here, and I can't help you kill the enemy. I can only temporarily block Enkidu for you. Quickly return to Kenmet. Don't forget your promise to me, you can't die here. She was Yun Nam Na. The goddess had actually put on her armor and had joined Ah's personal guard at some point in time. She had seen Enkidu's sword just now, and she was obviously worried that Ah would not be able to withstand it, so she suddenly rushed over to block the continent's #1 warrior. Although Murin and Enkidu were not at a disadvantage in the sword fight, it seemed that they could not defeat him, and could only cover for Ah as he retreated step by step. Can gods also put on their armor and enter the battlefield of the mortal world? Ah was shocked. At this time, Enkidu seemed to suddenly recognize the opponent in front of him, and he roared with a trembling voice, "Is that you? You're fighting me for him." The members of the personal guard team were not only required to be skilled in martial arts, but they were also a kind of ceremonial guard. When they were selected, there was also a requirement for their appearance, and they had to be uniform and about the same height. Taking a closer look at the bodyguard, Enkidu noticed that her figure was a little slender. When she retreated, she would twist her waist slightly. Even the intense battle could not hide the charm under the armor, making her look like a woman. After waving his sword a few times, Enkidu was able to recognize her. Inanna did not reply, but Gilgamesh, who was on the high platform in the distance, suddenly stood up and let out a whistle, calling for Enkidu to return immediately. When Enkidu heard Gilgamesh's call, he unwillingly slashed at the air with his sword, which seemed to have split open a spatial rift. Trembling with anger, he stomped his feet and flew back to Gilgamesh. As soon as he left, the invisible pressure that permeated the surroundings suddenly disappeared, and only then did Ah feel a wave of weakness, as though a powerful shackle had suddenly loosened. His body swayed, and he almost fell. Yun Nam Na grabbed his arm and ran towards the direction of the personal guard team. Meanwhile, Enkidu's personal guard team also took the opportunity to retreat. Ah seized the opportunity to get on a warhorse and galloped back to the city under the escort of his guards. When he entered the city, he looked to his side and found that Inanna had disappeared again. As he turned back to look, he heard her voice again. "The town of Kenmet and the mountains on both sides are the boundaries of the realm of the Ennead of Igut. It's not convenient for me to enter. I've already been careful enough, and I hope I didn't alarm them. Take care of yourself." As for Enkidu, he already has the power to fight against the gods in the mortal world. Whether it's a blessing or a curse, we won't have to wait too long to find out. Ah had already climbed up the city wall, and he asked in silence, "Yun Nam Na, why are you here? Can you answer a question for me? How did Enkidu become so powerful? On the battlefield today, his strength is clearly stronger than the first battle 10 days ago, so I was caught unprepared." This method of communication was very strange, and it was the application of some kind of brilliant message magic. Ah did not know where Yun Nam Na was, but he could hear her voice in his mind, but he could talk to her. It was like a soul connection, and there was no need for him to speak directly, and no one else could hear him. Yun Nam Na sighed. He has already glimpsed a glimmer of light behind the curtain of the sky, and his 9th-level body arts have reached the peak of the final realm. Just like before every advancement, he is on the verge of a breakthrough, so the eruption of power is almost invincible. What's more, he was born with divine strength, and if other warriors had the same realm, it would be difficult for them to be stronger than him. Ah was shocked. On the verge of a breakthrough? He's already a 9th-level warrior, will he become a god? Yun Nam Na replied, "This may be the most heroic and brilliant moment of his life. One day in the future, if you are allowed to join the Anunnaki divine clan, you will naturally understand all this. Ah, you have to protect yourself, live well, and it's best to stay away from the battlefield and killing. As for Enkidu, wait for him to die, and let him go crazy." While Ah and the queen were conversing with each other, the battle outside the city was still ongoing. Just now, he had led his heavy cavalry and personal guards out of the city to fight against Enkidu. When he retreated, the mages who accompanied him had thrown out all the remaining scrolls, causing a huge mess in the Uruk Legion's siege formation. Nearly half of the cavalry he had brought with him had died. At this time, the chariots and cavalry led by the Shadow Dragon and Vladimir had already entered the Uruk Legion's formation. The Uruk Legion was indeed well trained, and they should have been prepared for such a tactic. They did not blindly block the charge of the Egyptian chariots. Instead, once the battle began, the army at the back would split into two sides, allowing the chariots to pass through their formation and then attack from the sides. The side was the weakest point of the chariots' charge, and they needed the protection of the cavalry. The battle was in a stalemate, and Ah's goal was only to exhaust the Uruk Legion's fighting strength. He did not require the two commanders to engage in a decisive battle, but only needed to pass through the enemy's formation and retreat. This way, the Uruk Legion would not be able to continue attacking the city, and Ah's overall strategy would be a success. However, a tactical battle was not so easy. The speed at which the Uruk Legion changed their formation was faster than expected, and it was obvious that they were very skilled at it. The chariots in the center of the Igut Legion's formation passed through the enemy's formation without much resistance, while the chariots and cavalry on the flanks were in a stalemate. They were separated from the Uruk Legion's formation and were surrounded, and were in a very disadvantageous position. At this moment, the sounds of fighting on the battlefield inexplicably became weaker and further away. It was not because the warriors had put down their weapons, but because a strange power had enveloped the entire battlefield. It was like a formless pressure, and even the sounds nearby had become very faint and indistinct. The sunlight disappeared, and a huge shadow appeared on the ground. Ah, who was on the tower, subconsciously raised his head to look at the sky, and then seemed to be frozen in place. He stood there without moving or speaking. Not only him, but everyone inside and outside of Kenmet were shocked, and they realized that something was wrong. This included the soldiers on the battlefield. Beside Ah, the high priest of the temple of Isis, Vord, and the others had already knelt down, looking up at the sky and muttering prayers. Those who were still standing had not recovered from the shock. No one knew when, but a layer of clouds had appeared in the sky. The pure white clouds slowly condensed like a floating mountain, gradually forming the shape of an eagle. This was the totem of the king of Igut, Horus. The citizens of Igut had seen it countless times on various carvings since they were young, and they could not be more familiar with it. At this moment, the sky above the battlefield was impressively showing the miracle of Horus. After the huge eagle revealed itself, it spread its wings to protect the entire defensive line, and pointed its sharp beak at the two armies. Its pure white body was surrounded by 7 rays of light, and then countless light curtains descended from the sky, landing on the armies on both sides. This is the blessing of the gods, bless Egypt to achieve the final victory. Someone suddenly reacted, raised his weapon and shouted, and then the cheers resounded through the sky. The light curtains in the sky shone down, and the soldiers of Igut were instantly filled with strength and confidence, forgetting all the pain and exhaustion. This was a strange kind of blessing magic, and it was cast on all the soldiers on the battlefield. More importantly, it greatly boosted everyone's spirits. When the fanatical faith of countless people converged together, it was terrifying and indestructible. The light curtains also fell on the Uruk soldiers, but it did not have any effect. In fact, it even made them tremble and lose their courage. Ah, who was on the tower, also felt the blessing that descended from the sky. He could clearly sense the blessing power within, but it had no effect on him. The reason was strange and simple, because Ah did not believe in Horus, and had never truly sacrificed himself to this god. The blessing of Horus was only for his believers, and the trembling and powerlessness of the Uruk soldiers were more due to their fear of the god. Seeing that the people around him were full of vigor and glory, Ah, too, quietly cast a blessing magic on himself, and there seemed to be nothing wrong. Numna's voice faintly sounded in his mind again. Horus, that shameless bastard, he actually used this excuse to appear. Ah, who was still in shock, asked in confusion, what excuse? If a god can show his miracles to inspire the army, why didn't he appear earlier? Numna replied with a voice that was both disdainful and resentful, because I appeared in the battle, and although I tried my best to cover it up, he still found out. I am the god of Anunnaki, so Horus used this as an excuse to show his miracles in an attempt to change the outcome of this war. But I did it to protect you, and did not invade the divine realm of the Ennead. Although Horus's actions did not violate the agreement of the gods, it was despicable, and exposed his weakness and fear. After a brief silence, the battlefield was once again filled with deafening battle cries. The soldiers of the Igut who were originally in a tough battle were now reinvigorated, and they charged at the enemy without any regard for their own safety, brandishing their weapons in a frenzy. A's order was not to get tangled in battle, and only to pass through the enemy's formation. But looking at the current situation, the soldiers seemed to have forgotten to retreat, and the Uruk army was forced to retreat. Enkidu had already returned to the tower, and was standing side by side with Gilgamesh. The two heroes did not seem to care about the disadvantageous situation on the battlefield, and looked at each other before looking at the miracles in the sky at the same time. Both of them exuded an almost uncontrollable excitement, as if the moment they had been waiting for was finally here. Chapter 145. The might of slaying God A also noticed the reactions of Gilgamesh and Enkidu in the distance. While he was wondering what was going on, Gilgamesh suddenly waved his hand and gave an order. The priests of the Uruk Legion gathered around the platform and raised their staffs. A huge barrier of light rose to protect the platform, while Gilgamesh held his staff horizontally and closed his eyes. The figure of another god appeared in the sky above the battlefield. It had a muscular and beautiful body and was shrouded in a hazy rainbow light. It was taller than the city tower of Kenmet, but it was Gilgamesh's face. This was also a manifestation of a miracle. Gilgamesh's divine form in the air was not an illusion, but a body formed by the consciousness of an elephant after transcending the shackles of the body. Legend had it that only the gods could perform such an incredible miracle, but Gilgamesh had done it. In the last battle, he had manifested his divine form, but A was busy fighting with Enkidu at that time and did not see it. Now that he was witnessing it with his own eyes, he could not help but feel a little dazzled. He was a supreme mage and a supreme warrior, and unlike other mages or warriors, he had always been searching for the path to becoming a god, so he felt different. The figure that Gilgamesh had manifested was a real, pure self-consciousness that had been condensed over a long period of meditation. Cultivating to this level would not only awaken the so-called power bestowed by the gods, but also a different kind of existence after transcending the shackles of the body and mind, possessing all the magical power that one had cultivated in this life, close to the eternity of an elephant. A recalled Crazy Ol's words. Those who achieved the 9th level would have the power to fight against the gods, and could even be called demigods. Some of the so-called gods that appeared in the mortal world were probably only demigods. Seeing Gilgamesh, understood one thing. Not all level 9 achievers could be called demigods. If one wanted to appear as a god, there should be two possibilities. The first was to possess the power of two sides, becoming a 9th level mage and a 9th level warrior at the same time, and finally becoming a god. The second possibility was to reach the peak of the realm and touch the limits of human achievement, just like Gilgamesh and Enkidu. Gilgamesh was so arrogant that he didn't even put the gods in his eyes. He did have the capital to be arrogant. If one did not know who he was, and saw this miracle in the sky, who would dare to say that he was not a god? This person either knew the secrets of some gods, or he was a rare genius. While Ajahn was deep in thought, Gilgamesh, who was in midair, pointed at the huge cloud eagle. A golden light flew up from the high platform under his feet. It was a golden shuttle, and on it stood Enkidu, wielding a huge shield and broadsword. Gilgamesh himself was not on the shuttle, but he could control the shuttle to send Enkidu to the clouds. The giant eagle formed by the white clouds certainly saw Enkidu rushing towards it on the shuttle. It slightly folded its wings, opened its huge beak, and issued a strange whistling sound. This whistling sound carried a strong impact, but it could not be heard at all. Not only that, the soldiers on both sides of the battlefield could not hear anything at this moment, as if a mysterious power had drilled through their eardrums and directly into their brains. Their bodies went limp, and the battle had unknowingly stopped. Everyone stared at the sky, dumbfounded, and some people's weapons fell to the ground without them noticing. The people on the battlefield felt this way, but Enkidu, who was in the air, was directly facing the attack of the divine eagle. The golden light on the shuttle trembled incessantly, as if it would disperse at any time. The huge shield in his hand emitted a white light under the impact of the whistling sound, and suddenly became translucent. Gilgamesh's figure pointed at the giant eagle, controlling the shuttle to penetrate the obstruction and fly straight into the sky. The silent whistling sound suddenly became sharp, as if an irresistible force had erupted. The light on Gilgamesh's figure trembled, and the shuttle under Enkidu's feet and the huge shield in his hand could not withstand the impact, and suddenly exploded at the same time. The warrior let out a thunderous roar, and borrowed the force of the explosion to leap high into the air, wielding his broadsword with both hands and slashing at the giant eagle. Enkidu's burly figure seemed so small in front of the giant eagle, but the golden light of the sword was dazzling. It was 100 feet long, and like a giant blade cutting through the sky, it slashed at the head of the cloud eagle. On the watchtower, Mo felt his heart tighten. Although he knew that Enkidu was the enemy, he could not help but think of another person, crazy old Nietzsche. Goliath had once shown on Nietzsche the glorious last moment of his life. The scene of crazy old waving his staff and rushing into the clouds was so similar to the scene in front of him. Crazy old was already dead. Could it be that Enkidu had also gone mad? He and Gilgamesh had obviously been waiting for this moment, like crazy old waiting for a god to appear. The giant blade slashed at the cloud eagle. The cloud was intangible, and the sword light passed through it, as if it did not cause any damage. But the entire sky was shaking, and the cloud eagle dissipated. Then, a huge storm arose in the sky, and nothing could be seen clearly in the blink of an eye. Affected by the tempest, many of the people on the ground began to stagger unsteadily. Mo stood firm, and could see clearly. Gilgamesh's figure disappeared in the storm. On the watchtower, he opened his eyes again and raised his staff to the sky. A gust of wind rose, and wrapped around the descending Enkidu, and he landed firmly on the watchtower. Looking at the greatest warrior of the continent, his gloved right hand was only holding on to a broken broadsword, and the snake scales on his body were covered with terrifying cracks. An angry and dignified voice came from the sky, "You are crazy, how dare you offend the gods?" Then, the storm dispersed, and the huge cloud eagle disappeared. The sun shone down again, and the battlefield was silent for a moment. Only Enkidu was laughing out loud. His laughter was hoarse and tired, but it could not hide his excitement and fanaticism. He shouted towards the sky, "Horus, why don't you come down from the clouds and come to the battlefield? Could it be that the great god praised by the people is afraid? You've been defeated by us, haven't you?" Horus's voice reverberated above the battlefield. "What qualifications do you have to fight me, a man on the verge of death? You've merely slain the avatar of a god, and now you're facing the most tragic fate. No matter how strong you think you are, you can't escape the curse of fate." Then, there was no more sound. The god had left. No one spoke, and no one knew what to say. It seemed that Enkidu had dispelled the miracle Horus had performed, and Horus had left without showing himself. Before he left, he said a few words to salvage the situation, but no one knew if his threat was real or not. On the watchtower, raised his iron staff and sounded a long horn. This was the order to retreat. The Egyptian soldiers were stunned on the battlefield. Draco and Vades, the two corps commanders, suddenly came back to their senses after hearing the order. They shouted for the troops to retreat and quickly retreated from the battlefield before the enemy could react. Their mission had been completed. The Uruk legion did not pursue them, nor did they continue to attack the city. Instead, they slowly retreated. Today's battle was exceptionally fierce. Both sides suffered heavy casualties. The appearance of the god at the end was a soul-stirring spectacle. At this moment, the soldiers were no longer in the mood to continue fighting. The shock they felt was too intense, and they had yet to recover from it. Hogg walked down the tower and returned to the meeting hall. The generals around him were silent. Everyone was filled with questions, but no one was willing to say anything. An invisible solemn atmosphere shrouded everyone's hearts. Hogg ordered Kenmet and the camps on both sides to be on guard. He then had someone write a battle report for Pharaoh, and went back to rest. No one knew how to write a battle report, so he left it to the scribes in the army to write it. It had to reflect everything that happened on the battlefield, but it could not dampen the morale of the army, and it could not damage the dignity of the gods. The scribes were very good with words. The battle report described in detail how Hogg commanded the army to repel the fierce attack of the Uruk legion, and how the two corps commanders launched a heroic counterattack to inflict heavy losses on the enemy. The battle report emphasized that the Igut army had received the blessing of Horus. The great god appeared in the sky above the battlefield and encouraged the soldiers of Igut to repel the powerful enemy. When the god disappeared, he cursed the leaders of the enemy. They would receive the most terrible punishment in the world, and the Igut army would usher in the final victory. Reading the battle report carefully, it was indeed the case. Pharaoh attached great importance to it, because Horus had appeared, and everyone on the battlefield was a witness. Lazith too immediately summoned his ministers and people to hold a grand sacrificial ceremony in the shrine of Cape. He also sent emissaries to the front lines to solemnly reward the soldiers in the name of the god. As the commander-in-chief, of course, Amon received the heaviest reward. Before the war was over, he was conferred the title of Supreme General, blessed by the great god Horus, protector of Upper and Lower Egypt, defender of the empire, inheritor of the glory of Anare, and renowned throughout the kingdoms. The title was very long, and it was a high position. He also obtained a large territory on the outskirts of the city of Herak, south of Isis, and the residents of the territory became his slaves. This was not only because of his military achievements, but also because he had undoubtedly received the blessing of the gods, not through some kind of symbol, but because Horus had directly appeared on the battlefield. Pharaoh had to reward Hogg heavily, and his title had already surpassed that of the general governor of a city. But in this way, Hogg was in a predicament of being bound by the glory of the gods. In the war, he could only win, and unless he died on the battlefield, he could not retreat, let alone fail. Hogg, however, did not care about this. On the night after returning from the battlefield, he ordered everyone not to disturb him and meditated quietly under the starry sky in the backyard of his residence. After witnessing the miracles performed by Horus, as well as the appearance of Gilgamesh, and especially when Enkidu slashed at the cloud eagle, the depths of his soul seemed to be touched, and there was a trace of enlightenment that seemed hazy and clear, as if it was about to be captured. Chapter 146. Don't say my name. After attaining level 7, Ah felt the perfect fusion of his soul and power. The power no longer felt like it was bestowed or awakened, but something he was born with. The world was still the same, nothing had changed, but Ah felt different. The world he saw also changed, as if he could breathe with the rhythm of nature. After that, Ah passed through the monster-infested wilderness, guided Link and his people to the fertile land between the swamps, and met Inanna and another female goddess. He was sure that the path to godhood was right under his feet. After bidding farewell to Enlil in Saya, and learning about the Great Flood and crazy Ol from Goliath, he knew what he had to face. His faith was no longer shaken, but he was involuntarily involved in the war between the nations. He became the commander of the army, held the king of Hittite hostage, facilitated the peace talks between the two nations, and then became the commander-in-chief of the battlefield, leading thousands of soldiers to fight against the powerful Uruk legion. These experiences were full of ups and downs, and to outsiders, it was exciting. Himself also went through fire and water, but his heart became calmer and calmer. After going through all this, and after the consecutive battles with Enkidu, A's power of two sides had unknowingly reached the peak of level 7, which was much faster than his usual training speed. Fate made a man. When he calmed his mind and forgot all distractions, he no longer thought about the soul-stirring battle, and just focused on bathing under the stars. In a trance, there was no difference between his body and mind, and his body and soul were integrated into the starlight. He seemed to have become one with the world, and forgot where his body and mind were, or whether they were everywhere. In this strange meditation world, for the first time, A felt as if he had disappeared. In a vacuum, there seemed to be a little sprout. It was new life, power, light, seed, pure thinking, formless yet material. He felt as if he had been reborn, as if he was about to usher in a change that would make him reborn. The body and mind came from heaven and earth, and it was born out of nothing. When everything disappeared, it was like returning to the mother's womb. This ray of light was too wonderful for words. When I wanted to capture it, he woke up again. He heaved a long sigh, feeling inexplicably full of strength all over his body, and even a little restless. He simply wanted to find someone to fight. Even if the continent's #1 warrior, Enkidu, was standing right in front of him, he still had the confidence to defeat him. This kind of expansion of power and confidence made people feel very comfortable. However, Che suddenly became alert. He was on the verge of a breakthrough, but he hadn't crossed the path of a breakthrough yet. He didn't know what kind of test he would face. Clearly knew that he was no match for Enkidu. However, the exponential increase in his power made him desire to fight against Enkidu. He opened his eyes, and only then did he realize that the multicolored light on the horizon had already risen, and he was startled. Last night, he had given a strict order that no one was to disturb him or enter the backyard. Even if someone came in, how could they escape Jiahui's sharp senses? The state of meditation was also when one's senses were at their sharpest, and if there was any movement, it would be triggered. But anyone did not include a cat. Schrödinger was squatting in front of him, looking at him with a very complicated expression that Che had never seen before. Che didn't know when it came, and it was the first time he saw the cat taking the initiative to come so close to him. Detection magic could not detect the cat's whereabouts. Even Yun Namna did not notice Schrödinger hiding in Che's leather bag. The cat was like a silent ghost. But when Che opened his eyes, Schrödinger naturally released his breath. He really was a cat. Even when he closed his eyes, he could still feel the cat's body temperature and that unique trembling breath. This feeling was very intimate. Che reached out and hugged Schrödinger in his arms, stroking its furry body and said, "Schrödinger, what's wrong with you? Why are you looking at me with such pitiful eyes? Are you worried about me?" "Don't worry, we've been through so many dangers, I'm not afraid." Something even more surprising happened. Schrödinger actually spoke. Its voice sounded directly in Che's mind, like a direct flow of the soul. It was a soft and charming voice. "Che, it's because you're not afraid that I'm worried. I've waited for so many years, and finally today, I see a glimmer of hope. Bear can't save me, and Nietzsche can't help me. Even if they can, I can't believe it. It's too difficult to find someone who can be absolutely trusted and has this kind of ability." Che replied in his soul, You're finally willing to speak. Schrödinger, do you find it strange that I can speak?" Che, no, I would find it strange if you couldn't speak. I've been wondering when I could hear your voice, but I didn't expect it to be today. It's a bit sudden. Schrödinger, I've been waiting for the moment when I can have sex with you. My power is restricted by the seal, and I can't use it freely. You've finally touched the threshold of rebirth. If you can take this step, you can help me get out of trouble. Was surprised, restricted by the seal. What seal? Have you been waiting in trouble? How can I help you? Schrödinger, you already knew that I'm not an ordinary cat. When the day comes when you can help me, I'll tell you how to do it. But before that, you will face the most dangerous test of your life. You must live well. When that day comes, are you willing to help me? Was a bit confused. He didn't fully understand what Schrödinger meant, but he replied without hesitation, "Of course I'm willing. You've helped me too much. With your company and guidance, I've been able to get to where I am today. If you need me, I will do everything in my power to help you. This is not only a repayment, but also a sincere wish of mine." Schrödinger sighed and said, "For many years, I've been looking for a person who not only has the ability to unlock my seal, but also can refuse the greatest temptation in the world when I hand over my fate to him. He won't steal my divine power, ask about the secrets of the gods, or take advantage of the opportunity to bind me and order me around. I've finally confirmed that you're such a person, so I dared to ask you for help." Was so surprised that he didn't know how to answer. After a long while, he said, You, who sealed you? Could it be that when someone undid the seal, they would be able to seize your divine power and imprison you again? Don't worry, if I can help you, I will. You've given me enough. So you're... Schrödinger interrupted him, "Don't say my name, not even in the conversation of our souls. No matter what you've achieved, your attitude towards me has never changed. You still treat me like the cat you were when you first left Duke. It's not easy to do this, and you didn't do it on purpose, it just happened naturally. This is rare in the human world, so I've been waiting for you." Had been wondering about Schrödinger's identity for a long time, and why he was taken away by Bear. Unfortunately, Schrödinger didn't want to say. It wasn't that didn't think that he might be a god, and even guessed which god he was. It was just that he didn't know what happened to Schrödinger. Today, Schrödinger suddenly opened his mouth, which confirmed his long-held guess, and he couldn't help but feel a little embarrassed. He actually held a legendary goddess in his arms, and had been holding her for several years, even though she appeared in the form of a cat. What happened to Schrödinger? Didn't know. The cat didn't want to say much. Today, she opened her mouth to ask to give her a promise. From her tone, she said that when achieved the 8th level of the power of two sides, he could help her unlock the seal. At that time, she would tell what to do. Was about to face a test, and this test was very dangerous. She hoped that he could pass it safely. On the same night that sat in meditation, in a state of selflessness, he seemed to have touched the bud of a new life. Outside Kenmet, on a distant mountain, Enkidu was actually meditating. Gilgamesh stood by the side, holding his staff. When the sun rose from the horizon, Enkidu opened his eyes. The morning glow enveloped his body, and the continent's #1 warrior glowed with a dazzling spirit, as if the fatigue and pain brought about by the continuous battles had been swept away. The aura around his body was so strong that it was almost invincible. Gilgamesh was the first to speak. "You have never practiced magic, nor have you experienced the second awakening of power, but you have mastered the most profound magic, meditation. You can communicate with the basic power of any magic. Is this the pinnacle of body arts? To be able to communicate with the origin of the power of the world?" Enkidu nodded, "Yes, I didn't do anything deliberately. I just felt that the power grew with me, like a new life gradually ushering in a new world. It was very natural for me to enter this state. The gods must be hiding something, and your guess should be correct. Mortals can also be as strong as the gods, I can feel it." Gilgamesh asked, "What else did you feel?" Enkidu frowned, and replied, "I seem to see that world. It has nothing, but it is boundless and all-encompassing, full of unknown mysteries, as if symbolizing eternity. It is calling to me. I am walking towards it, and it is also walking towards me. It is about to transcend the origin of life." Gilgamesh sighed, "You touched this world before me, and are about to take this step. All these years, you have been wholeheartedly practicing body arts without any distractions, killing countless powerful opponents. As for me, as the governor, I have too many distractions, thinking and experimenting too much. I am not as focused as you. Enkidu replied, Gil, we are trying different paths. Perhaps we are both right, but our feelings are different. It was only today that I suddenly had an epiphany, as if I saw a ray of light behind the curtain in the darkness. Chapter 147. I want to duel with you. It was a sunny day, with a red sun shining down on the world, covering the two figures in a layer of golden-red radiance. Enkidu looked at the sun with his hands behind his back and said, killing Humbaba was the pinnacle of my life. Although it proved that I could stand shoulder to shoulder with the gods, I had reached the end of my training in body arts. Since then, no matter how hard I trained, I could no longer feel the breakthrough that I had experienced over the years. This caused me to be trapped for a long time. I even felt a sense of frustration and weakness, although no one could defeat me. But after several adventures on the battlefield, where Adudu even injured me, I felt as though I could see a turning point in my predicament. The enemy I faced was not an expert, but a powerful empire. It's been a long time since a war of this scale broke out on the continent. Since ancient times, the heroic achievements that have been passed down have all been established on the battlefield. The war stimulated my fighting spirit. I tried to kill Adudu several times, but I failed. Instead, the more I fought, the more courageous I became. The strength that had been trapped for a long time burst forth, and I returned to the pinnacle of my life. Not only did I regain the fearless feeling I had when I killed Humbaba, but I also vaguely felt a breakthrough. Gilgamesh nodded and said, I saw you kill Humbaba with my own eyes. I helped you seal off the battlefield so that he could not escape. I saw with my own eyes how terrifying the nine-headed serpent was when it transformed into its true form. And on the battlefield, I saw the invincible Enkidu, just like the warrior who killed Humbaba. But what is this breakthrough you speak of? Enkidu narrowed his eyes and replied, the war stimulated my fighting spirit. It was as though I had found something to pursue. But the appearance of the goddess completely ignited my anger. I have never been so angry, but I am so calm in my anger. Horus finally showed himself. I rushed to the sky and killed the cloud eagle. He was injured. He is a true god, the king god that the people of Aigut believe in. When my sword slashed across the sky, it was as if it had opened a path to eternity. Gilgamesh put down his staff and looked at the rising sun with his hands behind his back. He was silent as if he was chewing on Enkidu's words. After a long time, he said, you were at the end of a road where there was no road, but with great perseverance, you managed to force a way out. And I have always been searching for that path. Since the gods exist, then the secret to becoming a god must also exist. Seeing you today, I also see hope. The Geb Legion finally arrived at the Kenmit defensive line and joined up with the main army. The Geb army was hailed as the elite force that guarded the northern borders of the empire. However, when Al looked at them, he could not sense any of their morale or killing intent. It was no wonder that Al was disappointed. After all, he was comparing the Geb Legion to the veterans on the front lines. It had been a long time since the Empire of Aigut had experienced a large-scale war. No matter what kind of army, the baptism of war was the best way to nurture an elite soldier. The soldiers on the front lines had experienced 2 wars against the Hittite and Uruk legions. Regardless of victory or defeat, these soldiers who survived through heavy casualties had undergone changes that could be described as being reborn. The explosive power they displayed was not something that the Geb Legion, who had only gone through daily training, could compare to. Furthermore, only half of the Geb Legion had come. The other half was transferred from the garrison troops of the nearby cities, and the training of these garrison troops was far inferior to that of a regular army. Ordered the various units of the Geb Legion to be reorganized into various formations, and did not maintain a complete organizational structure. This caused Peter to be extremely dissatisfied, and he immediately protested against the commander-in-chief's unconventional actions. The reason was simple. After the legion was reorganized, the responsibility for defeat and the merits of victory were blurred. Furthermore, was just a rising star in the military. He had no foundation at his young age, and under special circumstances, he had become the commander-in-chief. This was not enough to intimidate the military leaders of the Empire of Igut. Peter was a newcomer, and didn't understand the situation on the battlefield. Disbanding his army was equivalent to stripping him of his authority to command. No commander would be willing to do such a thing, let alone a child who was still smelling of blood, giving such an order the moment they met. Peter almost flipped the table in the meeting, and he stood up to protest. Who was sitting in the middle, looked at him calmly. The order had been given, and it did not matter if Peter was willing or not, he had to carry it out. Without waiting for Adu to speak, the high priest of the empire, Liquid, stood up. He stretched out his hand and gently pushed Peter back to his seat, then said unhurriedly, not only the Geb legion, but also the Horus, Isis, Seth, and Anare legions. According to the needs of the battle, they will be stationed in Kenmit and the camps on both sides of the defensive line. If we did not do this, we would not have been able to repel the Uruk legion. The order has been given, and you will carry it out first. If you have any objections, please report to the pharaoh and wait for his reply. Vadin, Enk, Rod-Dik, and the other heads of the legion all expressed their opinions, and Peter had no choice but to carry out the order. But Min Sung, the chief priest of the Geb legion, said, "The legions can be reorganized, but the team of priests of the Geb legion is trained by me. I have the responsibility of supervising the army, so I must command them as a whole, and they cannot be separated. Their deployment must also be approved by me." Vord, the 9th-level mage and the high priest of the Temple of Isis, said in exasperation and amusement, "Min Sung, Lord Ricard, and I have no doubts about Lord Ador's command. Even we are under his command at all times. Why do you need to do this?" Ador waved his hand and said, "The Empire has decreed that the chief priest has the responsibility of supervising the army. The deployment of priests into battle must be approved by the chief priest. In that case, I will not object to Lord Min Sung's opinion. The team of priests of the Geb Legion will be under Lord Min Sung's sole command. Their mission is to defend Kenmit and assist the soldiers in defending the walls when the city is under siege. There is no need for them to leave the city to face the enemy. In order to let the new leaders understand the situation, we will show them the records of our battles with the Uruk Legion." Ricard, the 9th-level mage and high priest of the Empire's main shrine, personally demonstrated the magic of the two battles in the meeting hall. The scene where Enkidu slew a cloud eagle in the sky was especially shocking, even though everyone had seen it with their own eyes. Peter and Min Sung were dumbfounded. They did not expect the battle at the front lines to be so fierce, nor did they expect the enemy to be so terrifying. As soon as the two recovered from their shock, they stood up and bowed to Ador. Just as they were about to say something, the envoys sent by Pharaoh arrived, and the generals quickly lined up to welcome them. Ador received his latest reward, and his title was finally commensurate with his position as the commander-in-chief of the battlefield. No one had any objections, not even a trace of jealousy. Min Sung had originally wanted to change his mind and let Ador command the team of priests, but Ador had already given the order to command the magic formation to defend the city. Min Sung recalled the tragedy of the Uruk Legion's siege and the scene of Julian's death in the sky, and he felt uneasy for the next few days. What Min Sung was worried about did not happen. Gilgamesh sent someone to deliver a letter of challenge, agreeing to the final battle in 3 days' time. The content of this letter of challenge was thought-provoking, because Gilgamesh said, "the final battle," implying that he wanted to use this battle to determine the outcome of the battle. Either they would take down the Kenmit defense line in one go, or they would stop here. In fact, Ador did not want to continue fighting. Both sides had suffered heavy casualties since the beginning of the battle. Although the Uruk legion was brave and skilled in battle, under A's stubborn resistance, more than 2,000 soldiers had already died. Fighting through the desert far away from the city, it would be difficult to maintain the offensive if they continued to fight. According to the reports from the scouts, an army of nearly 1,000 soldiers had joined up with the Uruk legion, replenishing some of their depleted soldiers. They were the garrison army of Uruk. The garrison army was supposed to stay in the city to prevent anyone from taking advantage of the situation to attack. But now, the two legions of the kingdom of Babylon had assembled in the city of Kish, crossed the Euphrates River, and reached the northern border of the Saya Desert, threatening the Hittite kingdom. Without any worries, Gilgamesh used all the strength of the city, and it just so happened that Igut had received reinforcements from the Geb legion. Dor's reply had always been simple, with only one sentence: "I'll be waiting for you on the battlefield." 3 days later, on the plains outside of Kenmet, both sides once again arranged themselves in neat battle formations. Swords and spears stood in the air, and a murderous aura filled the air. Before the battle, asked Pyotr if he was a supreme warrior. Pyotr replied, "Yes, I am an 8th-level warrior. I have been stationed at the northern border of the empire for many years, and I have made countless contributions in the battles against the desert bandits and barbarians." Shao said, "Very well, you can wear the armor and hide among my personal guards." Pyotr was stunned. Actually wanted an 8th-level supreme warrior, the head of the empire's legion, to disguise himself as his personal guard. Wasn't this a little too insulting? But when he looked to his left and right, he saw that the other two legion heads, Vladislav and Ank, had already put on the armor of Dor's personal guards and lowered their masks to cover their faces. Gabriel, who had just recovered and could return to the battlefield, also joined Dor's personal guards. Madanzo, who had rested for many days, was the only one not wearing a mask because he was the captain of Dor's personal guards. Including Madanzo and Dor, there were a total of 6 supreme warriors under the commander's banner. Not only that, but the 2 9th-level supreme mages, Liquid and Wajhotep, also put on the armor of A's personal guards and entered the rear of the team protected by the supreme warriors, quietly hiding their staffs under their battle robes. Madanzo had never been so awe-inspiring before. He actually wanted to lead such a group of masters on the battlefield. The purpose of A's ambush was very clear: it was to target Enkidu. Since scrolls could not kill him, then he would use people to kill him. The first 2 battles had made us certain of one thing: Enkidu was crazy, but in his madness, he was extremely sober, and he wanted to kill him. Horus had already appeared, and he could not always count on Murin to protect him on the battlefield. But Murin's disguise as a personal guard also inspired him, so he had all the top masters in the army disguise as his personal guards. This was simply unimaginable, and he had never heard of anyone doing such a thing. Used his absolute authority in the army to give this order. Schrödinger said that he was about to face the most dangerous test and hoped that he would live well. Even if was not afraid of death, he would not throw his life away for no reason. This scene made Rod Dick's blood boil, and he wanted nothing more than to put on his armor and follow the personal guards to the front lines, but unfortunately, he was not a supreme warrior. The task that gave Rod Dick was to lead the reserve army and defend Kenmet with Min Song. In the event that the front lines were defeated, he had to cover the retreat of the scattered army into the city. The 2 9th-level supreme mages had already disguised themselves as personal guards, and the one commanding the priests was still George. Although George was not the most accomplished supreme mage in the army, he was the best at commanding battle formations. Led such a team into a battle formation, with Madanzo driving the chariot and sitting on it. Around him were personal guards in bright armor, and on both sides were rows of chariots. The battle formation of the Uruk legion was slightly different from the last time. Gilgamesh did not ride a chariot, but instead placed the high platform directly in front of the battle formation. In front of the platform were personal guards armed with spears and long shields, and behind the platform were the priests of the Uruk legion. Both sides were lined up with heavy cavalry and chariots. The battle formation was set up, and before the commanders of both sides could speak, a lonely figure carrying a heavy broken sword and wearing snake scale armor walked over and stood between the two armies. It was Enkidu. Even though he was an enemy, could not help but admire the fearless bearing of the #1 warrior on the continent. Just like that, he walked to the center of the battlefield as if he was taking a stroll. Also got down from the chariot and walked out of the battle formation alone. He nodded from afar and said, "Enkidu, the battle has not started yet, why have you come alone? Do you want to mount a sneak attack or surrender?" Enkidu held the broken sword upside down with one hand and pointed at with the other. He asked, "Supreme General who is blessed by the great god Horus, who guards the upper and lower Igut, who guards the dignity of the empire, who inherits the glory of Ra, and whose name is sung by all the kingdoms, is that you?" Nodded and said, "Of course it is me. You are very well informed to know my latest title so quickly. Why do you need to consult me when you already know?" Enkidu said with an expressionless face, "It's good that it is you, Supreme General I want to ask you a few questions, and with the glory of a warrior, I will give you a choice." Frowned slightly. "If you want to ask, then ask. Do you, a warrior, also want to argue on the battlefield?" Enkidu asked unhurriedly, "May I ask, is the empire of Igut or the kingdom of Babylon an eternal existence on the continent since ancient times?" This question stumped It was not that he did not know the answer, but that he could not answer it. Of course, the Igut was not an eternal empire since ancient times. Legend has it that the first pharaoh was Osiris, and it was created by the gods. Later, Horus, the son of Osiris, became the guardian of the empire, and so generations of pharaoh regarded themselves as the incarnation of Horus on earth. But he could not say it directly, otherwise it would damage the dignity of the empire, and it would be easy for others to use it against him, and it would also easily dampen the morale on the battlefield. Smiled and replied, "The empire of Igut is with the gods, and it is a kingdom illuminated by the glory of Horus. These have long been engraved on the pillars of the temples. As for the kingdom of Babylon, it seems that you, a warrior of Babylon, do not know much about it. Go back and ask someone else." Enkidu did not dwell on this issue with and said in a deep voice that spread throughout the battlefield, "The empire of Igut is not eternal, and its territory has changed many times in history. The gods have obtained eternal life, but the people who believe in him have experienced the pain of life and death for generations, using their limited lives to guard or compete for territory for the eternal gods. Don't you think this is ridiculous?" Ah's frown deepened. These words were not unreasonable, but saying it on the battlefield was a blatant blasphemy against the gods. But did not reprimand Enkidu, but asked instead, "Why don't you ask Marduk whether it is ridiculous or not?" Enkidu finally smiled, "You can't answer my question, or you are unwilling to answer, but the faith in your heart will not be shaken in the slightest, right? Look at the soldiers of our two countries, shedding unnecessary blood for the eternal gods. As the supreme general of the empire, with your status, shouldn't you bear more responsibility?" Was so angry that he almost laughed, wondering if there was something wrong with the mind of the first warrior of the continent. He actually said that the soldiers of both sides were shedding unnecessary blood for the gods. Did Enkidu not kill enough people himself? He coughed and said seriously, "Enkidu, aren't you wrong about one thing? It was you who led the army to invade Igut, and the soldiers behind me are not only fighting for the glory of the gods, but also to protect their homes, to protect the dignity of each of them. What are you trying to say by talking so much?" Enkidu clapped his hands. "Good. Then fight for the dignity of each of us. I challenge you to a duel with the glory of a warrior. I heard that you captured the king of Hittite alive in a 1,000-mile raid, and have been honored as the first warrior of the continent. Not long ago, you were conferred the title of Supreme General by the pharaohs of Igut to guard the Igut, to protect the dignity of the empire, to inherit the glory of an Ra, and to be praised by all nations. Surely you won't refuse my request in front of thousands of soldiers?" Ah's expression was a little strange. He reached out and rubbed his chin. Because this is a battle between two armies, why should I agree to your request for a duel? If you steal from my family or bully my friends, I may be interested in dueling with you. As he spoke, Ah cursed in his heart. This Enkidu is too much of a bully. Who gave him the idea of a duel? He really lost face in front of thousands of soldiers. Is this the fault of Yun Nam Na? Being called the first warrior of the continent by the king of Hittite is akin to roasting him over a fire. Ah's ability is not bad, but a duel with Enkidu is no different from courting death. Naturally, he should refuse this request in front of two armies, but it will inevitably give others the impression that he is timid, damaging the morale of the army and his own prestige. Chapter 148. Dialogue on the battlefield. Ah Hen's expression changed a little. Enkidu's offer of such conditions was a complete disgrace to him. If Enkidu lost the duel, the Uruk Legion would have to retreat, which would be equivalent to a great victory for the Empire of Igut. If Ah Hen lost, Enkidu did not request for the Igut army to surrender. He only requested for them to withdraw from the defensive line and not engage in battle. Ah Hen would resign from his position as Commander-in-Chief and Supreme General. This would be his personal failure. But Ah Hen was very clear about the actual situation. There were no conditions to speak of. If he lost, he would not have the chance to resign and would only die on the battlefield. But under such circumstances, if he did not agree to the duel, people would inevitably say that he was greedy for power and was unwilling to stand up for the country. At this moment, Gilgamesh, who was standing on the platform, said, I have prepared the documents and asked everyone present to bear witness. If Enkidu is defeated in the duel, the Uruk Legion will withdraw from the Igut army. Ah Hen wanted to drag Gilgamesh off the platform and give him a good beating, but on the surface, he smiled and said, Enkidu, I have also issued an invitation to a duel, but not with you. Please call Marduk here. As soon as these words came out, the army was in an uproar. There were people on both sides saying all kinds of things, and the battlefield was filled with a buzz. Gilgamesh and George shouted at the same time, and the army returned to silence. Ah Hen did not wait for Enkidu to reply and laughed in a loud voice, My apologies, my words have blasphemed the gods you believe in. Warriors are not to be insulted, and Marduk will not accept an invitation to a duel from a mortal like me. I take back what I said just now. But I do want to issue an invitation to a duel. Enkidu, I know your intentions very well. If I refuse your request, people will accuse me of being greedy for power and refusing to stand up for the country. So I now declare that if anyone dares to say that, I will duel with him. The battle of tens of thousands of soldiers is not a battle of strength. As the commander-in-chief, how can I decide the outcome of the battle with you, a personal guard captain? If you really want to prove how strong you are, then go to the docks and compete with people to unload goods. I believe that no one on this continent is your match. The Igut army roared with laughter, and Enkidu was enraged, waving his broken sword at Ah, you coward. But his voice was immediately drowned out by the war drums and the thunderous sound of horse hooves. When Ah said the last sentence, he had already raised his hand and waved forward, giving the order to charge. This time, he suddenly gave the order to launch an attack on the Uruk Legion. He leaped high into the air and landed on Madanzo's chariot. His personal guards also charged into the center of the battlefield. Enkidu was still standing between the two armies, and he was alone. It was the best opportunity to encircle this supreme warrior, and Aku did not want to miss it. Although he had refused the invitation to duel, Ah was not the least bit afraid. His chariot charged at the forefront, and before the chariot arrived, he had already leaped forward, waving his iron staff to attack Enkidu. This scene was witnessed by everyone. Although Ah had refused to duel, he was still the first to charge towards Enkidu on the battlefield. Enkidu stood in the center of the battlefield. The Igut army was already charging at him, but the Uruk Legion had yet to reach him. Could he turn around and run away before charging back with his men? The arrogant number one warrior of the continent naturally would not do such a thing. With a roar, he swung his broken sword at Os iron staff. Before the sword and staff could collide, a dazzling light exploded, and a huge shockwave spread out in all directions. The same scene had already happened several times in the battle between the two. Enkidu stood firmly in place, while Ah, who was pouncing in midair, was sent tumbling back. It was not easy to be sent flying. Enkidu's sword was meant to kill him, but Ah was already prepared with the help of spatial magic. Although he had used all his strength in that attack, it was actually a counterattack. How could Enkidu allow Hoodlum to escape from his grasp? With a roar, he charged at Hoodlum and swung his sword at Hoodlum, who had yet to land on the ground. However, the sword did not hit its target. Instead, several rays of light flew towards Hoodlum, each of which contained different kinds of magic attacks. Some were like angry roars that attacked the mind, some were like huge waves, some were like cracks in the ground, and some were like blades of air condensed into a gale. 3 rays of light blocked the sword in the air, while 2 rays of light went straight for Enkidu. At first glance, it was obvious that there was an ambush. Not to mention that the ones who could launch such attacks were at least supreme warriors who had undergone the second awakening of power. Moreover, the weapons they used were not the standard long swords of the personal guards. Since Enkidu had come, there was no need to hide the supreme warriors in the personal guards. Madanzo brandished his snake-toothed dagger, Gabriel brandished a silver battle axe, Blaze used a sharp magic spear, and Peter used a long sword engraved with strange patterns. As for the chief supreme warrior of the Shrine of Isis, Ankh, he even took out his long-handled wolf-fang sword. As he waved it, a heavy sound of wind and thunder could be heard. The 5 supreme warriors surrounded Enkidu as soon as they made their move. The center of the battlefield turned dark in an instant. Even the horses within 100 steps could not stand still. The personal guards did not continue to charge. Instead, they formed a defensive formation in the distance, holding spears and shields. A curtain of light rose outside the shield wall. Ah stood behind the shield wall and did not participate in the battle. Amidst the heavy protection, 2 personal guards behind Ah raised their staffs. Along with the chanting, not only did the brilliance of the personal guard's shield wall connect like an iron wall, but there were also twisted lights and shadows hovering in the sky. When one of the 5 supreme warriors was shaken away from the battle by Enkidu's sword, light immediately sprinkled on his body. Whether it was healing magic or blessing magic, they were the highest level of magic, performed by the 9th level supreme mage without hesitation. In the battle between the supreme warriors and Enkidu, it was difficult for the people outside to intervene. The impact and explosion of energy caused the battlefield to be in a state of chaos. It was almost impossible to target Enkidu and attack him individually. Large-scale indiscriminate attack magic could not be used, but the 2 9th-level supreme mages could take turns to help in this way. This was already the greatest power that Ah could invest in this part of the battlefield. Even if they could not kill Enkidu, they would exhaust him to death. If they could not exhaust him to death, they would at least trap him to death. It was believed that there were few people on the continent who could gather such a powerful force to deal with an enemy alone. Although the bravery of an ordinary man could not be relied on, to the extent that Enkidu was strong, he was a terrifying existence on the battlefield. Sometimes the proportion of casualties was not large for the whole army, but a small breakthrough would cause a chain breakdown of the battle formation and the soldiers would panic and trample on each other. Many major defeats were caused by this. This kind of large-scale battle often lasted for a whole day. If the commander could not calmly mobilize the various ranks of the battle formation to charge and defend, it would be troublesome if they lost their footing. Therefore, Ah had to trap Enkidu and prevent this almost invincible supreme warrior from leading an elite force to break the front line of the Igut army. In the previous 2 battles, Enkidu had also wanted to do this, but Ah had risked his life to stop him. In the center of the battle formation, the battle began. A's personal guards stood in formation, while the chariots on both sides had already begun to charge, colliding with the Uruk legion's charge. The sound of fighting in the wilderness was like a tsunami, and the final battle had finally begun. Enkidu was not afraid at all under the siege of the experts, and he was even cursing in the midst of the battle. His curses were drowned out by the huge impact, but A did not need to listen to know that he was cursing it himself. Instead of fighting him head-on, he used this kind of method to gang up on him. Enkidu's entire body shone with a golden light. Only half of the heavy broadsword was left, but when he swung it around, he could vaguely make out a complete, golden greatsword. Wherever his sword swept past, several supreme warriors would be pushed back by a surging force. Even the supporting magic arts seemed to have lost their magic and turned into a pure collision of magic. What kind of martial art was this? It was pure and simple, but it was superb. It could no longer be described as a body art. It seemed to contain the power of the world's most brilliant magic arts. Just the transformation of the broken sword into its full form was already beyond the comprehension of a warrior. No one could take on Enkidu's seemingly illusory broadsword head-on. They could only surround him and cover for each other, barely trapping him in place. If not for the two supreme mages helping them, it would have been difficult to stop Enkidu from escaping. A's face was gloomy. Enkidu's strength had once again exceeded his expectations. In just a few days, the supreme warrior had become even more powerful. His power was like an undercurrent surging in the sea, almost unfathomable. If Enkidu wanted to escape, it would be difficult for the 5 supreme warriors to trap him until the end of the battle. Enkidu, on the other hand, was willing to fight under siege because he was confident that he could break through the layers of obstacles and kill the 5 supreme warriors who had been watching the battle with their iron staff in their hands but did not lend a helping hand to Enkidu. He was the commander-in-chief of the army and had to oversee the overall situation. He also had to protect the 2 supreme mages behind him from sneak attacks. More importantly, the other master of the enemy, Gilgamesh, was slowly approaching. And the 2 9th-level supreme mages were waiting for him. After Enkidu fell into the siege of the masters, Gilgamesh, who was on a high platform in the distance, also saw the situation clearly. He knew what A's intentions were, and he had absolute trust in Enkidu, so he was not too worried. However, the commander of the Uruk Legion could not allow A to arrange the battle so easily. He floated down from the platform and boarded his chariot. At the back of the Uruk Legion's formation, a man flew into the air with a staff in hand. Like George of the Igut army, he took over the command of the army. He was a 7th-level supreme mage from the Marduk shrine of Uruk. The staff in his hand was slightly curved, made from Humbaba's ribs. Gilgamesh was not the only supreme mage in the Uruk Legion, but the other masters were overshadowed by him and Enkidu. People rarely even heard of their names. Gilgamesh boarded his chariot. Enkidu was already in the middle of the battle. There were no horses in front of the luxurious chariot. Gilgamesh pointed with his staff, and the chariot strangely started moving on its own. The bodyguards walked in front of the chariot with round shields and long swords in their hands. The shields flickered with brilliance, not only forming a defensive formation, but also emitting a cold light that seemed capable of piercing through all obstacles. Gilgamesh's chariot was followed by a team of mages. Unlike the teams of mages in other legions, these 20 mages held staffs in their left hands and rode on horses. They all had curved Damascene swords hanging from their waists. It was rare to see a priest equipped with a weapon, but they were actually equipped with a scimitar used by cavalry to charge and slash. They all wore light armor engraved with divine runes, and when they used divine runes, a protective shield would appear around their bodies and horses. It was not easy for Gilgamesh to train this special team of bodyguards. They were all advanced mages and could charge on horseback. In the distance, A watched Gilgamesh and his bodyguards approach and narrowed his eyes. He was paying attention to the strange team of mages behind the chariot. They could directly charge on the battlefield without the protection of warriors. It was a pity that there were only 24 of them. Ah knew that Gilgamesh was not only a 9th-level mage, but also a 6th-level warrior. Not to mention magic, just in terms of martial arts, this governor was even stronger than the average supreme warrior. This was because he was born with divine power like Enkidu, but the path of practice was different. According to Goliath, Gilgamesh was the only supreme mage he knew, and he had gone through the second awakening of power to practice body arts from the beginning. But Ah knew another person, Crazy Ol's early disciple, Bear, who was also a 9th-level supreme mage and a 6th-level warrior. Bear was not invincible. He died under the secret encirclement of a group of masters of Igut, so Gilgamesh was not invincible. But Bear and Gilgamesh took a different path. Bear explored the power of two sides of the same body, and after many detours, he finally made a discovery. What Gilgamesh did was another kind of experiment, which was to practice body arts from the beginning after the second awakening of power with the achievements of a supreme mage. Now it seemed that the governor was not only trying it himself, but also secretly training a group of mages to do the same. He held a second awakening ceremony for a group of advanced mages and let them learn low-level body arts. The successful ones were the 24 personal guards that Ah was looking at now. These personal guards were wearing armor and helmets. When they put down their helmets, could not see their facial features clearly. But when he looked carefully, he felt that two of them were very familiar. He had obtained a strange ability from the underworld, which was to feel the inner emotions of others. This ability was not effective on everyone, but there was no problem using it on these two people. The two people's emotions were very complicated, and they were even in a state of contradiction. In the face of such a fierce battlefield, who would have the time to think about other things? They were Abel and Cain of the personal guards. These two brothers were Ah's personal disciples, and they also practiced the power of two sides. After becoming advanced mages, they were praised by Gilgamesh and promoted to the position of priests of the shrine and priests of the Uruk Legion. With a little disguise, they easily passed the second awakening of power and joined this special team of personal guards. In the past, Gilgamesh would not let this team of mages go to the battlefield like this, but for some reason, he did not hide it anymore and let them go to the front line on horseback. When Aragorn noticed the two brothers, they were also using message magic to play dirty. Cain said to Abel, "My brother, today is the final battle, and we are finally going to the battlefield. Our benefactor is over there, what should we do?" Abel replied, "Of course we will kill the enemy when we go to the battlefield. If we are unlucky enough to face our benefactor, we will only defend and not attack, and we will not reveal our identity. We will repay our benefactor's kindness and not make things difficult for him. Besides, with our benefactor's ability, if we really meet him, we will not be able to fight back at all. It will be good enough if we can dodge." Cain asked again, "Yesterday, the governor asked you about the secret of our training. Why did the second awakening of power go so smoothly, and why did we practice body arts so quickly? The governor's eyesight is very sharp, and I feel that I can't hide it anymore. In today's battle, the governor and Lord Enkidu will fight at the same time, and our benefactor will definitely die. The power we practice may really become a secret forever. What should we do?" Abel asked in return, "My brother, what are you trying to say?" Cain, "In fact, the governor and Lord Enkidu have long known that our benefactor is a magician, and they must have been prepared to deal with it. After our benefactor dies, if the governor asks about the secret of our training again, how should we deal with it?" Abel, "This is war, and the result is not something you and I can control. How can you say that our benefactor will die? If the governor asks, we will answer as we should. We promised our benefactor not to say his name, and we can't say what he taught us. Since we have made a promise, and we have obtained today's status, we must abide by it." Cain, "If our benefactor dies in battle, no one can teach us anymore. Even if our benefactor doesn't die, he will not be able to teach the profound achievements of this power to the enemy. But the governor of Gil is an invincible hero on the continent, far stronger than our benefactor. Even if we don't say our benefactor's name, we can still offer the secret of the power of two sides. Not only can we get more, but we can also continue to ask him for advice. Abel said resolutely, "No, we can't do this. This is not in line with our beliefs, and we will be trapped forever. My brother, as long as I am alive, I will never agree to do this. Moreover, the governor of Gil is asking me, not you. You don't have to worry, I naturally know what to do." Cain was a little unwilling to give up and asked again. The governor of the city asked a few times, but he only asked you. He never thought of coming to me at all. We both practice the power of two sides, but you are always a level higher than me. Whether it is divine arts or body arts, you are better and faster at mastering them. Did your benefactor teach you more secrets, including the cultivation of higher-level achievements? Abel sighed, "Brother, how many times have I said it, really not, we have all received the same teachings. If you stop thinking about these things, maybe you can achieve the same achievements as me." You're tuning in to the Blissful Bookshelf YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.